Welcome, true believers, to the complete and twisted tale of Spider-Man's greatest nemesis. Tonight, we journey through the dark corridors of Norman Osborn's fractured mind and the emerald shadows of the Green Goblin. From a brilliant industrialist's tragic transformation to his role as the web-slinger's most personal and devastating enemy, this is a story that spans decades of madness, revenge, and the thin line between genius and insanity. So settle in, let your mind drift like morning mist over the spires of New York as we explore the entire history of the Green Goblin, from his first cackling appearance to his latest schemes. The story of Norman Osborn's transformation into the Green Goblin begins not with a laboratory accident or a moment of sudden madness, but in the quiet shadows of a childhood that would shape one of the most brilliant and dangerous minds in the Marvel Universe. There's something almost tragic about those early years, the way a young boy's need for approval and recognition would eventually twist into an obsession with power and control that would consume not just his own life, but the lives of everyone around him. Norman Osborn was born into a world of expectations and disappointments, raised by a father whose own failures had left deep scars on the family name. The Osborn legacy was one of missed opportunities and squandered potential, a burden that young Norman felt pressing down on his shoulders from the moment he was old enough to understand what it meant to carry such weight. His father, a man broken by his own inability to achieve greatness, took out his frustrations on his son in ways both subtle and profound. The elder Osborn was a man who had once harbored dreams of scientific achievement and business success, but who had watched those dreams crumble through a combination of bad decisions, worse timing, and the simple reality that genius and ambition alone were not enough to guarantee success in a world that often rewarded mediocrity over brilliance. His bitterness became a poison that seeped into every interaction with his son. Every conversation that should have been filled with encouragement, instead becoming another reminder of failure and inadequacy. Young Norman learned early that love was conditional, that approval had to be earned through achievement, and that weakness was not just discouraged, but actively punished. These lessons would become the foundation stones of his character, the core beliefs that would drive him to heights of success and depths of depravity that few could imagine. The boy who should have been learning about unconditional love and acceptance was instead being taught that human worth was measured in accomplishments and that empathy was a luxury that successful people could not afford. School became Norman's first real arena for proving himself, and he threw himself into his studies with the kind of focused intensity that would become his trademark throughout his life. He was brilliant. There was no denying that. But his brilliance was always coupled with a desperate need to be recognized as superior to his peers. He didn't just want to succeed, he wanted others to fail so that his success would seem even more impressive by comparison. The young Osborn's intelligence was accompanied by an almost supernatural ability to understand and manipulate the people around him. He could read their weaknesses, their insecurities, their deepest fears and desires, and he learned to use this knowledge as a tool for gaining advantage. What should have been a gift for understanding human nature instead became a weapon for exploiting it, as Norman discovered that he could get what he wanted by making others feel small and inadequate. His relationship with his father remained complex and toxic throughout his adolescence, a mixture of desperate desire for approval and growing resentment at the older man's failures. Norman began to see his father as weak, as someone who had given up when he should have fought harder, and this perception colored his understanding of what it meant to be strong. In his mind, strength became synonymous with ruthlessness, success became more important than happiness, and power became the only measure of a man's worth. The death of Norman's father, when he was still a young man, marked a turning point in his psychological development. Rather than grieving for the loss of a parent, Norman found himself feeling primarily relief that he was finally free from the weight of paternal disapproval. But the relief was accompanied by a realization that terrified him. He had become more like his father than he cared to admit, carrying the same bitterness, the same fundamental dissatisfaction with life, the same tendency to blame others for his own shortcomings. This recognition might have led another person to seek help, to try to break the cycle of dysfunction that had defined the Osborne family for generations. But Norman's response was characteristically different. Instead of trying to become a better person, he decided to become a more successful one, believing that external achievement could somehow fill the void where emotional health should have been. College years brought new opportunities to prove his superiority, and Norman threw himself into his studies with the same obsessive energy that had characterized his earlier education. He majored in chemistry and business, seeing these as the tools he would need to build the empire he envisioned for himself. His professors recognized his brilliance but were often disturbed by his lack of ethical boundaries and his willingness to sabotage other students' work to ensure his own success. It was during these college years that Norman first began to formulate the ideas that would eventually drive him to create Oscorp. He didn't just want to build a company, he wanted to build a legacy, something that would prove once and for all that Norman Osborn was not just successful, but superior to everyone who had ever doubted him. The company would be his monument, his proof that he had transcended the failures of his family's past. After graduation, Norman began the slow, methodical process of building his business empire. He started small, acquiring patents and developing chemical processes that would form the foundation of what would eventually become one of the largest corporations in New York. Every decision was calculated, every relationship was evaluated in terms of its potential utility, and every opportunity was seized with the kind of ruthless efficiency that would become his trademark. The early years of Oscorp were marked by Norman's willingness to do whatever it took to succeed. He bought out competitors, stole ideas from former colleagues, and manipulated business relationships with the same cold precision that he had once used to manipulate his classmates. Success came, but it came at a price that Norman was either unwilling or unable to recognize. Each victory required him to sacrifice a little more of his humanity. Each achievement demanded that he become a little more isolated from the people around him. Marriage came as another strategic decision rather than an expression of love. Norman chose his wife not because she made him happy, but because she represented the kind of social respectability that he believed would enhance his business prospects. She was beautiful, well-connected, and intelligent enough to serve as an appropriate partner for a rising industrialist. What she was not was someone Norman was capable of truly loving, because love required a kind of vulnerability that he had trained himself to view as weakness. The birth of Harry Osborn should have been a moment of joy and hope for the future, but for Norman it represented something more complicated. On one hand, Harry was proof of the Osborn legacy continuing, a biological insurance policy for the continuation of everything Norman had built. On the other hand, the child was also a reminder of Norman's own childhood trauma, a potential source of the same disappointment and inadequacy that had poisoned his relationship with his own father. Norman's approach to fatherhood was predictably problematic. He loved Harry in his own way, but it was a love that came with conditions and expectations that no child should have to bear. Harry was expected to be brilliant, successful, and strong from the moment he could walk and talk. Any sign of weakness or normalcy was met with disappointment and criticism that echoed the treatment Norman had received from his own father. The pattern was repeating itself, the cycle of emotional dysfunction that had defined the Osborn family for generations finding new expression in the relationship between Norman and his son. But Norman was too focused on building his empire to recognize what he was doing, too convinced of his own superiority to see that he was becoming the same kind of father that had damaged him so profoundly. Oscorp continued to grow throughout Harry's early childhood, expanding into new areas of research and development that pushed the boundaries of what was considered scientifically possible. Norman's company became known for its willingness to explore controversial areas of research, to pursue projects that other companies considered too dangerous or ethically questionable. This reputation attracted both brilliant scientists who were eager to push boundaries and government contracts that came with enormous budgets and minimal oversight. It was during this period of expansion that Norman first encountered Mendel Stromm, a brilliant biochemist whose theories about human enhancement were considered revolutionary by some and dangerous by others. Stromm was exactly the kind of scientist that Norman sought for Oscorp: brilliant, ambitious, and willing to pursue research that might be considered unethical by conventional standards. The partnership between Norman and Stromm was initially beneficial for both men. Stromm provided the scientific expertise that Norman lacked, while Norman provided the business acumen and financial resources that Stromm needed to pursue his research. Together, they began to develop chemical formulas and enhancement serums that promised to revolutionize human capability and performance. But the relationship was doomed from the start. Poisoned by Norman's inability to trust anyone and his compulsive need to maintain control over every aspect of his empire, he began to resent Stromm's scientific expertise, seeing it as a potential threat to his own authority within the company. Norman's ego could not tolerate the possibility that anyone might be more important to Oscorp's success than he was, even if that person was his own business partner. The breaking point came when Norman discovered that Stromm had been using company funds for personal expenses, taking unauthorized loans from the business account to cover his own financial difficulties. While Stromm fully intended to repay the money and had done nothing to actually harm the company, Norman saw the transgression as an opportunity to rid himself of a partner who had become more liability than asset. The betrayal of Mendel Stromm was calculated and cruel, designed not just to remove a business partner but to destroy a man who had trusted Norman with his life's work. Norman could have simply confronted Stromm about the unauthorized loans, could have worked out a repayment plan, or even forgiven the transgression in recognition of their partnership. Instead, he chose to have his partner arrested, using the letter of the law to destroy someone who had considered him a friend. Stromm's arrest and imprisonment marked another crucial step in Norman's transformation, from ambitious businessman to something far more dangerous. The ease with which he had destroyed his partner's life, the satisfaction he felt at having eliminated a potential rival, these emotions should have served as warning signs that Norman was losing touch with basic human decency. Instead, they served as confirmation of his own power and superiority. With Stromm gone and his assets seized by the company, Norman found himself in possession of years of research notes and experimental formulas that represented the biochemist's life work. Any ethical person would have felt guilty about profiting from stolen research, would have recognized that these formulas belonged rightfully to their creator, but Norman felt only excitement at the possibilities that Stromm's work represented, the potential for breakthroughs that could make Oscorp even more powerful and profitable. Among the seized materials was a particular formula that caught Norman's attention, a green-tinted serum that Stromm's notes described as a strength and intelligence enhancer with unprecedented potential. The formula was incomplete, marked with warnings about instability and potential side effects. But Norman saw only the promise of human enhancement that could give him advantages over his competitors and enemies. The decision to experiment with Stromm's unfinished formula was perhaps the most fateful choice Norman Osborn ever made. A more cautious person would have recognized the dangers, would have conducted extensive testing before even considering human trials. But Norman's arrogance and impatience overrode any concerns about safety or scientific protocol. He convinced himself that his own intelligence was sufficient to complete Strom's work, that he could succeed where his former partner had failed. Working alone in his private laboratory, Norman began the process of refining and completing the enhancement formula. He threw himself into the work with the same obsessive energy that he had brought to every other aspect of his life, convinced that success was not just possible, but inevitable. The irony was lost on him that he was using his betrayed partner's research to achieve the kind of breakthrough that could have made them both rich and famous if they had worked together. The weeks leading up to the accident were marked by increasing isolation and manic behavior as Norman pushed himself to complete the formula. He worked long hours, neglected his family responsibilities, and became increasingly irritable with anyone who questioned his judgment or interrupted his research. The laboratory became his world. The formula became his obsession, and everything else, including his wife and son, became secondary considerations. Harry, still a young child, began to see even less of his father during this period, as Norman's attention became completely absorbed by his scientific work. The few interactions they had were marked by Norman's impatience and criticism, as he found his son's normal childhood behavior increasingly irritating and disruptive to his research. The distance between father and son grew even wider, setting the stage for the psychological damage that would eventually drive Harry to follow in his father's footsteps. The night of the accident began like any other, with Norman alone in his laboratory, working on the final stages of the enhancement formula. He had convinced himself that he was on the verge of a breakthrough, that this particular combination of chemicals would finally produce the stable enhancement serum that had eluded Strom for years. His confidence was absolute, his excitement was palpable, and his caution was non-existent. The formula's color had been troubling him for weeks. The sickly green tint that seemed to intensify with each modification he made. Normal scientific protocol would have suggested that such dramatic color changes indicated chemical instability, but Norman interpreted them as signs that the formula was becoming more potent and effective. His arrogance blinded him to the obvious warning signs. His desperation for success overrode his scientific training. When the solution began to bubble and froth, Norman should have immediately evacuated the laboratory and called for hazardous material specialists. Instead, he leaned closer, fascinated by the chemical reaction he had triggered, and convinced that he was witnessing the birth of his greatest triumph. The explosion that followed was both inevitable and catastrophic, filling the laboratory with toxic fumes and searing Norman's face and body with chemical burns that would leave permanent scars. The physical damage from the accident was severe but survivable. Norman was rushed to the hospital with burns covering much of his upper body, chemical poisoning that affected his respiratory and nervous systems, and brain trauma that the doctors feared might prove fatal. But the medical team was skilled and dedicated, and through their efforts, Norman's life was saved even though the full extent of the damage to his brain remained unknown. What the doctors could not have anticipated was that the accident had done more than just damage Norman's brain. It had fundamentally altered his neurochemistry in ways that would not become apparent until much later. The enhancement formula that had exploded in his face had been absorbed through his skin and lungs, entering his bloodstream and crossing the blood-brain barrier to work its intended effects on his neural pathways and cognitive processes. Norman's recovery was slow and painful, marked by periods of delirium and confusion that worried the medical staff and terrified his family. Harry spent long hours at his father's bedside, hoping for some sign of recognition or affection. But Norman's attention, even during recovery, was focused inward on the strange new thoughts and sensations that were beginning to emerge in his damaged brain. When Norman finally regained full consciousness and was able to speak coherently, it became clear that something fundamental had changed about him. His intelligence, always formidable, now seemed almost supernatural in its scope and precision. He could see patterns and connections that had previously eluded him, could solve complex problems with an ease that amazed his doctors and business associates. But the enhancement of his intellectual capabilities came at a terrible cost. The same chemical process that had expanded his mental capacity had also stripped away many of the emotional and ethical constraints that had kept his darker impulses in check. The guilt he might once have felt about his treatment of Strom was gone, replaced by satisfaction at his own cleverness. The love he had struggled to express for his family was overshadowed by a cold calculation of their utility to his plans and ambitions. The change in Norman's personality was gradual at first, manifesting as increased irritability and impatience with anyone who couldn't keep up with his enhanced mental processes. He became more demanding of his employees, more critical of his family, and more contemptuous of anyone he perceived as intellectually inferior. What had once been arrogance became megalomania. What had once been ambition became obsession. Harry bore the brunt of his father's transformation, as Norman's expectations for his son became even more unrealistic and his criticism became even more cutting. The child who had once hoped for his father's approval now lived in fear of his father's disappointment, walking on eggshells in his own home, and developing the anxiety and insecurity that would plague him for the rest of his life. Norman's wife, too, began to see changes in her husband that frightened and confused her. The man she had married had been cold and distant, but he had at least been predictably human in his motivations and behavior. The man who returned from the hospital was something else entirely, brilliant beyond belief but lacking in basic human warmth and empathy. Their marriage, never strong to begin with, began to deteriorate as Norman became increasingly absorbed in plans and schemes that he shared with no one. It was during the long months of recovery that Norman first began to conceive of the idea that would eventually become the Green Goblin. The enhanced intelligence that the accident had given him was coupled with a growing sense of superiority over the rest of humanity, a belief that normal, ethical, and legal constraints were simply obstacles to be overcome, rather than principles to be respected. The criminal persona began as a thought experiment, a way for Norman to explore the possibilities that his enhanced capabilities offered without the restrictions imposed by his public identity as a respectable businessman. He found himself fascinated by the idea of operating outside the law, of using his intelligence and resources to achieve goals that conventional society would never allow. The choice of a goblin motif was not random but psychologically significant, representing the emergence of all the dark impulses and repressed anger that Norman had been accumulating throughout his life. The goblin was the embodiment of his resentment toward his father, his contempt for his competitors, his rage at a world that had taken so long to recognize his superiority. It was also a way to distance himself from the crimes he planned to commit, creating a separate identity that could bear the moral responsibility for actions that Norman Osborn could never publicly acknowledge. The months that followed the accident were spent in careful preparation and planning, as Norman used his enhanced intelligence to design the equipment, weapons, and strategies that would make the Green Goblin a force to be reckoned with in the criminal underworld of New York City. Every detail was considered, every contingency was planned for, every possible advantage was calculated and exploited. The transformation was complete long before Norman ever put on the goblin mask for the first time. The accident had not created a monster so much as it had released one that had been growing in the shadows of Norman's psyche for years. The enhancement formula had simply provided the catalyst and the capability for Norman to become what he had always had the potential to become: a brilliant, ruthless, and utterly immoral individual who saw other human beings as nothing more than obstacles or tools to be used in pursuit of his own twisted goals. As Norman prepared for his debut as the Green Goblin, he felt none of the nervousness or uncertainty that might have been expected from someone embarking on a criminal career. Instead, he felt a sense of liberation and excitement, as if he were finally free to express his true nature after years of pretending to be something he was not. The mask and costume were not disguises but revelations, allowing the world to see the monster that Norman Osborn had always carried within him. The emergence of the Green Goblin from the shadows of Norman Osborn's tortured psyche represents one of the most fascinating creative collaborations and conflicts in comic book history. Behind the scenes at Marvel Comics in the early 1960s, two legendary creators were locked in a philosophical battle that would ultimately shape not just the Green Goblin's origin, but the very nature of superhero storytelling itself. Stan Lee, the bombastic editor and writer who had already revolutionized comics with the creation of Spider-Man, had initially envisioned the Green Goblin as something far more supernatural and mythological than what would eventually appear on the printed page. His original concept called for an ancient creature of legend, perhaps awakened from an Egyptian sarcophagus, or summoned from some forgotten realm of magic and mystery. This approach would have fit perfectly with Lee's love of grandiose concepts and cosmic-level threats. But Steve Ditko, the enigmatic artist whose distinctive style had brought Spider-Man to visual life, had very different ideas about what the Green Goblin should represent. Ditko's vision was grounded in a more realistic approach to storytelling, one that emphasized human psychology and believable motivations over supernatural explanations. In his view, the most terrifying villains were not monsters from beyond the veil of reality, but ordinary human beings who had chosen to become monsters through their own actions and decisions. The creative tension between Lee and Ditko extended far beyond simple disagreements about character design or plot direction. It represented a fundamental philosophical divide about the nature of evil itself and how it should be portrayed in popular entertainment. Lee's approach suggested that evil was something external and otherworldly, a force that invaded normal reality from outside. Ditko's vision implied that evil was something internal and human, a corruption that grew from within and was therefore both more relatable and more frightening. This philosophical conflict would eventually contribute to Ditko's departure from The Amazing Spider-Man after issue 31, but not before the two creators had managed to craft one of the most memorable and enduring villains in comic book history. The Green Goblin that finally appeared in The Amazing Spider-Man number 14 was a perfect synthesis of both approaches, supernatural in appearance and capabilities, but ultimately human in origin and motivation. The issue that introduced the Green Goblin to the world opened with a scene that perfectly captured the mysterious and menacing nature of the character. In a shadowy basement laboratory hidden somewhere in the urban labyrinth of New York City, a figure worked in darkness, surrounded by the tools and equipment that would become the trademark arsenal of one of comics' greatest villains. The laboratory itself was a character filled with bubbling beakers, electrical equipment, and half-finished inventions that suggested a brilliant but twisted scientific mind at work. The costume hanging in the foreground of that first panel was immediately iconic, even though readers had not yet seen it in action. The Goblin mask, with its leering grin and malevolent eyes, suggested something that was simultaneously comical and terrifying, a visual representation of the thin line between humor and horror that would characterize the Green Goblin's approach to villainy. The purple and green color scheme was both garish and memorable, designed to stand out against the red and blue of Spider-Man's costume while suggesting something unnatural and corrupt. But it was the flying broomstick visible in that first appearance that truly captured the imagination of readers and established the Green Goblin as something unique in the pantheon of comic book villains. Here was a character who combined high technology with supernatural imagery, science fiction with gothic horror, modern urban crime with ancient folkloric traditions. The broomstick, while primitive compared to the glider that would later become the Goblin's signature vehicle, immediately established him as a villain who could take the fight to Spider-Man in 3 dimensions. The Goblin's partnership with the Enforcers in his debut appearance was a masterstroke of characterization that revealed important aspects of his personality and methodology. Rather than working alone or creating his own criminal organization from scratch, the Goblin chose to manipulate existing criminals, using his superior intelligence and resources to coordinate their activities while remaining safely in the background. This approach demonstrated both his strategic thinking and his fundamental contempt for other people, whom he viewed as tools to be used rather than partners to be respected. The Enforcers themselves were perfectly chosen as the Goblin's temporary allies, representing different aspects of physical criminality that could be enhanced and directed by the Goblin's scientific and strategic superiority. Fancy Dan's acrobatic skills, Montana's lasso expertise, and the Ox's brute strength provided the Goblin with a diverse range of capabilities, while allowing him to remain focused on the larger strategic picture. Their eventual defeat by Spider-Man served to establish the web-slinger's physical superiority while setting up the Goblin as a more cerebral and long-term threat. The first battle between Spider-Man and the Green Goblin established many of the patterns and themes that would define their relationship for decades to come. Unlike many superhero confrontations that were settled through simple applications of superior strength or speed, the Spider-Man versus Green Goblin dynamic was built around intelligence, strategy, and psychological warfare. The Goblin's weapons were as much designed to confuse and disorient as they were to cause physical harm, reflecting his understanding that defeating Spider-Man would require more than just overwhelming force. The dialogue in that first encounter revealed the Goblin's aristocratic pretensions and his belief in his own intellectual superiority. His speech patterns were formal and somewhat archaic, suggesting either genuine upper-class breeding or an affected attempt to distinguish himself from common criminals. This verbal style would become one of the character's most distinctive features, marking him as someone who saw crime not as a desperate survival strategy but as an intellectual exercise and a form of artistic expression. The Goblin's escape at the end of his first appearance was handled with characteristic flair, demonstrating his ability to plan ahead and his unwillingness to take unnecessary risks. Rather than fighting to the bitter end like many villains might have done, the Goblin recognized when the situation had turned against him and made a strategic withdrawal, living to fight another day. This pragmatic approach to villainy would become another defining characteristic, marking him as someone who was driven by long-term goals rather than momentary impulses. The mystery of the Green Goblin's identity became one of the most compelling ongoing storylines in The Amazing Spider-Man, creating a sense of anticipation and speculation that kept readers coming back month after month. Leon Ditko's decision to keep the Goblin's face hidden was brilliant, from both a storytelling and a commercial perspective, allowing them to build suspense while also providing themselves with maximum flexibility in revealing the character's true identity when the time was right. The clues scattered throughout the early Green Goblin appearances were subtle but significant, building a psychological profile of the villain that would ultimately point toward Norman Osborn as the most logical candidate for the role. The Goblin's obvious wealth, his scientific knowledge, his familiarity with advanced technology, and his apparent connections to both the criminal underworld and legitimate business interests all suggested someone with significant resources and multiple areas of expertise. But perhaps the most important clue was the Goblin's obsession with Spider-Man himself. An obsession that went far beyond simple criminal opportunism or random villain-hero conflict. There was something personal in the Goblin's approach to their battles, a sense that defeating Spider-Man was not just a means to an end, but an end in itself. This personal dimension suggested that the Goblin's true identity would be someone with a connection to Peter Parker's civilian life, someone who could make the conflict between hero and villain truly meaningful on multiple levels. The evolution of the Green Goblin's equipment between his first and second appearances demonstrated the character's commitment to continuous improvement and his refusal to be satisfied with anything less than perfection. The replacement of the flying broomstick with the more sophisticated glider was not just a visual upgrade, but a statement about the Goblin's approach to his criminal career. He was not content to rely on crude or primitive tools when superior alternatives were available. The new glider was a masterpiece of both form and function, combining the practical requirements of aerial transportation with the psychological impact of its distinctive bat-like appearance. The design suggested something that was simultaneously technological and organic, manufactured and alive, modern and primeval. It was the perfect vehicle for a villain who existed at the intersection of multiple different genres and storytelling traditions. The introduction of the pumpkin bombs in the Goblin's second appearance was another stroke of genius that helped establish his unique identity in the crowded field of comic book villainy. These weapons were both highly effective and deeply symbolic, combining serious destructive capability with an almost childish sense of playfulness that made the Goblin simultaneously more threatening and more unsettling. The jack-o'-lantern imagery connected the character to Halloween traditions and folkloric concepts of mischief and malevolence. The variety of specialized weapons and gadgets that the Goblin employed demonstrated both his scientific expertise and his theatrical sensibilities. The razor bats, the electrical discharges from his fingertips, the various gas formulations, and the other Halloween-themed implements all served practical purposes, while also reinforcing the Goblin's carefully crafted persona. Every piece of equipment was designed to be both functionally superior and psychologically memorable. The Goblin's costume itself evolved between appearances, becoming more refined and sophisticated while maintaining all of the elements that made it instantly recognizable. The mask became more expressive and detailed, the body armor became more form-fitting and practical, and the overall color scheme became more vibrant and eye-catching. These improvements reflected the character's growing confidence and his increasing commitment to his new criminal identity. The underground reputation that the Green Goblin began to build during his early appearances was carefully cultivated and strategically managed. Rather than seeking immediate recognition or gratification, the Goblin understood the value of building credibility slowly and methodically. Each successful operation added to his legend. Each demonstration of his capabilities made him more feared and respected by the criminal community. The Goblin's approach to building his reputation was notably different from most comic book villains, who typically announce their presence with dramatic public displays of power or grandiose threats against society at large. Instead, the Goblin worked through existing criminal networks, enhancing their capabilities and coordinating their activities while allowing them to take most of the public credit and attention. This approach allowed him to build real power and influence without exposing himself to unnecessary scrutiny. The respect that the Goblin earned from other criminals was based not just on his obvious wealth and advanced technology, but on his demonstrated ability to think strategically and plan complex operations that succeeded where others had failed. The criminal underworld was accustomed to dealing with individuals who were either brilliant but impractical or ruthless but short-sighted. The Green Goblin represented something new, a villain who combined intellectual superiority with practical effectiveness and long-term vision. The psychological warfare that the Green Goblin employed against Spider-Man was perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of his early criminal career. Rather than simply trying to defeat the web-slinger through superior firepower or overwhelming force, the Goblin understood that Spider-Man's greatest strengths were also potential weaknesses that could be exploited by a sufficiently clever opponent. The hero's compassion, his sense of responsibility, his need to protect innocent bystanders, all of these admirable qualities could be turned against him by someone willing to manipulate them. The Goblin's attacks were often timed and positioned to force Spider-Man into impossible choices between his own safety and the welfare of others. This approach served multiple purposes. It put the hero at a tactical disadvantage. It demonstrated the Goblin's understanding of his opponent's psychology, and it created dramatic situations that were as much about moral conflict as they were about physical combat. The public nature of many of their early battles was also strategically significant, as the Goblin understood the importance of public perception in shaping both his own reputation and Spider-Man's effectiveness as a hero. By forcing their confrontations into public spaces where innocent bystanders could be endangered, the Goblin ensured that Spider-Man would be fighting at a disadvantage, while also creating opportunities to demonstrate his own power and ruthlessness to potential allies and enemies. The mystery surrounding the Green Goblin's identity became a source of fascination not just for readers but for the characters within the story itself. Spider-Man's attempts to uncover the truth about his new enemy were hampered by the Goblin's careful operational security and his apparent ability to blend seamlessly back into whatever legitimate identity he maintained during daylight hours. This cat-and-mouse dynamic added an element of detective fiction to their relationship that distinguished it from simpler hero-villain conflicts. The failure of Spider-Man's early attempts to unmask or capture the Green Goblin served important storytelling functions beyond simply maintaining the mystery for readers. These failures demonstrated that the Goblin was a more formidable opponent than the various street-level criminals that Spider-Man had previously encountered, someone who required different strategies and approaches. They also established a pattern of tactical defeat, followed by strategic withdrawal that would characterize their relationship for years to come. The psychological impact of these early encounters on Spider-Man himself was subtle but significant, introducing elements of doubt and frustration that had not been prominent in his previous adventures. The web-slinger's inability to definitively defeat or capture the Green Goblin began to weigh on him, creating a sense of unfinished business that would drive him to take increasingly greater risks in their future encounters. The Green Goblin's methods of gathering intelligence about Spider-Man demonstrated both his scientific resources and his understanding of the importance of information in achieving strategic advantage. Rather than relying on chance encounters or public confrontations, the Goblin began to study his opponent systematically, analyzing his fighting techniques, his response patterns, and his apparent limitations. This methodical approach marked him as a villain who was playing a longer game than most of Spider-Man's enemies. The respect that the Goblin showed for Spider-Man's abilities, even while plotting his defeat, was another distinguishing characteristic that set him apart from other villains. He did not underestimate his opponent or dismiss him as merely lucky or temporarily successful. Instead, he acknowledged Spider-Man's genuine capabilities while working to develop countermeasures and exploiting weaknesses. This professional approach to their conflict elevated it above simple good versus evil dynamics. The technological superiority that the Green Goblin displayed in his early appearances was not just about having better weapons and equipment, but about understanding how to use technology strategically to achieve specific goals. Every piece of his arsenal was designed for particular purposes and integrated into larger tactical and strategic frameworks. This systematic approach to criminal technology distinguished him from villains who relied on single, powerful weapons or crude applications of force. The theatricality that characterized the Green Goblin's approach to crime was not mere showmanship, but a calculated psychological strategy designed to enhance his effectiveness and build his reputation. The dramatic entrances, the elaborate costumes, the themed weapons, and the flamboyant dialogue all served to create a larger-than-life persona that would be remembered and feared long after any individual encounter had ended. As the Green Goblin's early appearances drew to a close, the stage was set for revelations and developments that would transform him from a mysterious criminal mastermind into something far more personal and threatening. The careful foundation of mystery, competence, and psychological sophistication that Lee and Ditko had built would soon support storylines that would make the Green Goblin not just another villain, but Spider-Man's most personal and devastating enemy. The emergence from shadows was complete. Now the real war could begin. The revelation of Norman Osborn as the Green Goblin represents one of the most perfectly executed unmasking sequences in comic book history, a moment that transformed what had been an intriguing mystery into a deeply personal and psychologically complex conflict. The journey toward this revelation began not with dramatic confrontation or accidental discovery, but with the careful introduction of Norman Osborn as a seemingly unrelated character in the broader tapestry of Peter Parker's civilian life. The first appearance of Norman Osborn in The Amazing Spider-Man number 37 was handled with characteristic subtlety by Stan Lee, who understood that the most effective surprises were those that seemed inevitable in retrospect, while remaining completely unexpected in the moment. Norman was introduced not as a potential villain or mysterious figure, but as Harry Osborn's father, a successful businessman whose wealth and social status made him a natural part of the world that Peter Parker was beginning to navigate as he matured from awkward teenager to young adult. The initial presentation of Norman Osborn was carefully crafted to misdirect reader suspicions while laying the groundwork for future revelations. He appeared to be exactly what he claimed to be, a driven, successful industrialist who had built Oscorp into one of New York's most prominent corporations through a combination of scientific innovation and business acumen. His interactions with Peter were cordial but distant, suggesting the kind of polite disinterest that a busy executive might show toward his son's college friend. But beneath this carefully constructed facade, Lee was planting subtle clues that would prove significant once the truth was revealed. Norman's obvious wealth provided a plausible explanation for the Green Goblin's advanced technology and elaborate equipment. His scientific background and corporate resources explained how someone could develop and manufacture the sophisticated weapons and devices that the Goblin employed. His position in New York's business community provided the social connections and legitimate cover that would allow a criminal mastermind to operate undetected. Perhaps most importantly, Norman's relationship with Harry created the personal connection that would make the eventual revelations so devastating for Peter Parker. This was not just another case of a hero discovering that a villain was someone he had encountered in his civilian identity. This was the horrifying realization that his best friend's father, a man he had respected and looked up to, was also his most dangerous and implacable enemy. The relationship between Peter and Harry had been developing throughout the early years of The Amazing Spider-Man, evolving from casual acquaintanceship to genuine friendship as the two young men navigated the challenges of college life and early adulthood together. Harry represented something that Peter had rarely experienced: a normal friendship with someone his own age, who was not connected to his superhero activities. This friendship was precious to Peter because it offered him a glimpse of the ordinary life that his responsibilities as Spider-Man often prevented him from enjoying. Harry's struggles with his father's expectations, and his own insecurities created a bond between the two friends that went deeper than their shared academic experiences. Peter could relate to the pressure of living up to adult expectations, though he could never explain that his own pressures came from the responsibility of being Spider-Man rather than from parental demands for academic or professional success. This shared understanding of pressure and responsibility, even though they could never fully discuss its true nature, created a foundation of mutual support and genuine affection. Norman's presence in this friendship was initially benign, but increasingly significant as the storylines progressed. Peter's occasional visits to the Osborn household gave him opportunities to observe Norman in his domestic environment, to see him as a father and husband rather than just as a public figure. These observations revealed aspects of Norman's personality that were troubling even before his villainous identity was known. His coldness toward Harry, his obsession with business success, and his apparent inability to connect with his family on an emotional level. The development of Norman's character during this period was a masterclass in subtle characterization, as Lee revealed disturbing personality traits and behavioral patterns while maintaining the character's surface respectability. Norman's treatment of Harry was particularly telling, showing a man who was psychologically and emotionally abusive, even when he was not actively engaged in criminal activities. The neglect, the impossible expectations, the casual cruelty disguised as parental concern, all of these elements painted a picture of someone whose moral compass was already severely damaged. Peter's growing awareness of Norman's flaws as a father created complex feelings of protectiveness toward Harry and discomfort with Norman himself. As someone who had lost his own father figure in Ben Parker, Peter was sensitive to the dynamics of surrogate-father relationships and could see how Norman's treatment was damaging his son's psychological development. This awareness created tension in Peter's relationship with the Osborn family even before he knew about Norman's criminal activities. The scientific expertise that Norman displayed in casual conversations also served as subtle foreshadowing of his connection to the Green Goblin's advanced technology. His knowledge of chemistry, his familiarity with advanced manufacturing processes, and his casual references to experimental research projects all suggested someone who possessed the technical skills necessary to create the Goblin's sophisticated arsenal. These details seemed natural and unremarkable at the time, but would prove significant once the full truth was revealed. The psychological profile that emerged from Norman's civilian appearances was consistent with someone who could become the Green Goblin, even though readers were not yet meant to make that connection. His ruthlessness in business dealings, his manipulation of personal relationships for advantage, and his apparent lack of empathy for anyone who could not benefit his goals all suggested a personality that was capable of much darker actions than simple corporate maneuvering. The gas that would ultimately lead to the Green Goblin's discovery of Spider-Man's secret identity was introduced as part of the ongoing development of the Goblin's technological capabilities rather than as a specific plot device designed to engineer the revelation. The concept of a gas that could neutralize Spider-Man's spider sense was both scientifically plausible within the comic book universe and tactically logical as something the Goblin would want to develop given his methodical approach to defeating his opponent. The spider sense had been established as one of Spider-Man's most reliable defensive capabilities, allowing him to detect danger even when his conscious mind was not aware of threats. The Goblin's development of a counteragent for this ability demonstrated both his scientific sophistication and his understanding of Spider-Man's strengths and weaknesses. This was not a weapon designed for general use, but a highly specialized tool created specifically to give the Goblin an advantage over one particular opponent. The deployment of this gas in the fateful encounter that would lead to the unmasking was handled with characteristic precision by the Goblin, who understood that he would have only one opportunity to use this particular advantage before Spider-Man became aware of its existence and developed countermeasures. The timing and location of the attack were carefully chosen to maximize the chances of success while minimizing the risk of exposure or interference from outside parties. The moment when Spider-Man's spider sense failed him was both shocking and inevitable, the culmination of the Goblin's patient preparation and methodical approach to their conflict. For readers who had become accustomed to the spider sense as an almost infallible early warning system, its sudden absence created a sense of vulnerability and danger that elevated the tension of the encounter beyond that of previous battles between the two opponents. The alley where Peter Parker was changing from his Spider-Man costume back into his civilian clothes was chosen with symbolic significance as well as tactical advantage. Alleys had been established throughout the series as liminal spaces where Peter's two identities intersected, places where the transformation between superhero and ordinary young man took place away from public observation. The violation of this private space by the Green Goblin represented a fundamental breach of the boundaries that Peter had established to protect his dual identity. The image of the Green Goblin hovering silently behind the unsuspecting Peter Parker as he changed clothes has become one of the most iconic moments in Spider-Man history, capturing the precise instant when the balance of power in their relationship shifted dramatically in the Goblin's favor. The visual composition of this scene, with the menacing figure of the Goblin looming over the vulnerable and unaware young man, perfectly encapsulated the themes of surveillance, vulnerability, and violated privacy that would define their relationship going forward. The capture and transportation of the unconscious Peter Parker to the Green Goblin's lair was handled with characteristic efficiency and planning, demonstrating once again the Goblin's superior strategic thinking and preparation. Rather than attempting to unmask Spider-Man immediately, or engaging in the kind of gloating monologue that characterized many comic book villains, the Goblin methodically secured his captive and transported him to a location where he could conduct his revelation under controlled circumstances. The lair itself was revealed to be a sophisticated headquarters that reflected both the Goblin's wealth and his scientific expertise, filled with advanced equipment, experimental weapons, and monitoring systems that would allow him to maintain surveillance over his various criminal enterprises. The laboratory aspects of the facility suggested someone who was actively engaged in research and development, constantly working to improve his capabilities and develop new advantages over his opponents. The restraints used to secure Spider-Man were not simple ropes or chains, but sophisticated devices that took into account the web-slinger's enhanced strength and agility, demonstrating yet again the Goblin's thorough understanding of his opponent's capabilities and his refusal to underestimate any aspect of the threat that Spider-Man represented. Every precaution had been taken. Every contingency had been planned for. Every detail had been considered and addressed. When Peter Parker finally regained consciousness to find himself bound and helpless in the Green Goblin's lair, the psychological impact of his situation was even more devastating than the physical danger he faced. For the first time since becoming Spider-Man, he was completely at the mercy of an enemy who knew his secret identity and could therefore threaten not just him, but everyone he cared about. The protective barriers that he had constructed between his superhero activities and his civilian life had been shattered, leaving him exposed and vulnerable in ways he had never experienced before. The Green Goblin's decision to reveal his own identity was presented not as an impulsive gesture or a moment of dramatic excess, but as a calculated psychological strategy designed to maximize Peter's despair and helplessness. By showing Peter that his enemy was someone connected to his civilian life, someone who had been observing and evaluating him without his knowledge, the Goblin transformed their conflict from a straightforward battle between hero and villain into something far more complex and personal. The theatrical nature of the unmasking, with the Goblin's dramatic gesture and accompanying monologue, reflected both his ego and his understanding of the psychological impact that such moments could have on his opponents. This was not simply about revealing information, but about demonstrating power, about showing Peter that he had been completely outmaneuvered and that his enemy possessed advantages that he had never suspected. The words that accompanied the revelation were chosen with careful precision to maximize their psychological impact. The Goblin's reference to this being the last face that Spider-Man would ever see was both a death threat and a psychological assault, designed to associate Peter's final moments with the face of someone he had known and trusted in his civilian identity. The juxtaposition of familiarity and menace was intended to create a sense of betrayal and violation that would haunt Peter, even if he somehow managed to escape. The moment when the Green Goblin removed his mask to reveal Norman Osborn's face was crafted to be simultaneously shocking and inevitable, the culmination of subtle hints and careful foreshadowing that had been building throughout the character's development. For readers who had been following both storylines, the revelation recontextualized everything they thought they knew about both characters, creating a narrative revelation that enriched and complicated the entire series. Peter's reaction to seeing Norman Osborn's face beneath the Green Goblin's mask was portrayed with psychological realism that acknowledged the full horror of the situation. This was not just the disappointment of learning that someone he had respected was actually a villain, but the devastating realization that his best friend's father was his most dangerous enemy. The implications for his relationship with Harry, for his sense of safety in his civilian identity, and for his ability to trust his own judgment about people, were all immediately apparent. The reference to Harry in Peter's stunned response served multiple narrative functions, reminding readers of the personal connections that made this revelation so devastating, while also foreshadowing the complications that would arise from Norman's dual relationship to Peter as both father figure and mortal enemy. The simple exclamation, "You're Harry Osborn's father," carried with it the weight of a friendship betrayed and a trust violated in the most fundamental way possible. The psychological dynamics established in this moment would define the Spider-Man divided by Green Goblin relationship for decades to come, creating a conflict that was simultaneously public and private, heroic and personal, professional and intimate. Norman Osborn was not just another criminal for Spider-Man to apprehend, but a presence that had infiltrated his civilian life and poisoned his personal relationships through deception and manipulation. The revelation scene also established the Green Goblin as Spider-Man's first major enemy to discover his secret identity, a precedent that would make him uniquely dangerous among the web-slinger's rogues gallery. Other villains might be more powerful or more ruthless, but none of them possessed the intimate knowledge of Peter Parker's civilian life that would allow them to threaten him in ways that went beyond simple physical confrontation. The implications of Norman's knowledge extended far beyond Peter himself to encompass everyone in his civilian life who could potentially become targets for the Green Goblin's revenge. Aunt May, Harry, Gwen Stacy, and everyone else connected to Peter Parker were now vulnerable in ways they could never understand or prepare for, creating a web of potential threats that would complicate every aspect of Peter's life going forward. The masterstroke of this revelation was how it transformed the nature of heroism itself within the Spider-Man narrative, making it clear that being a superhero was not just about fighting criminals and protecting innocent people, but about maintaining the psychological and emotional boundaries that allowed for the existence of a private life separate from heroic responsibilities. The violation of Peter's secret identity represented a form of assault that went beyond anything he had previously experienced. As the unmasking scene concluded with Norman's triumphant declaration of his true identity, The stage was set for confrontations that would test not just Spider-Man's physical abilities, but his psychological resilience, his moral principles, and his capacity to maintain his heroic identity in the face of the most personal and devastating betrayal he had ever experienced. The Green Goblin was no longer just another villain to be defeated, but a cancer that had infected the very foundations of Peter Parker's carefully constructed dual existence. The cycles of memory loss and recovery that would define Norman Osborn's relationship with his Green Goblin identity represent one of the most psychologically complex and narratively sophisticated elements in all of superhero comics. What began as a convenient plot device to allow the character to return from apparent defeat evolved into a profound exploration of the nature of identity, responsibility, and the capacity for human redemption in the face of unforgivable actions. The electrochemical accident that caused Norman's initial amnesia was both a dramatic climax to his first major confrontation with Spider-Man and the beginning of a psychological journey that would span decades of storytelling. The accident itself was not random, but the direct result of the intense hatred and violence that had come to characterize their battles. As Spider-Man's desperation to stop the Green Goblin led to increasingly dangerous tactics, and Norman's megalomaniacal obsessions drove him to take ever greater risks. The laboratory where their final battle took place was filled with the same kind of experimental equipment that had originally transformed Norman from ambitious businessman into enhanced criminal mastermind. The presence of high-voltage electrical systems and unstable chemical compounds created an environment where even a relatively minor mishap could have catastrophic consequences for anyone caught in the resulting explosion or electrical discharge. When Spider-Man's kick sent the Green Goblin crashing into the electrochemical apparatus, the resulting surge of electricity through Norman's already chemically altered brain created a form of trauma that was both physical and psychological. The electrical current disrupted the neural pathways that had been enhanced by the original Goblin formula, creating a form of selective amnesia that specifically targeted the memories and personality changes associated with his criminal activities. The medical explanation for Norman's condition was necessarily vague, as the doctors treating him had no knowledge of the chemical enhancements that had altered his brain chemistry or the specific nature of the trauma that had caused his memory loss. From their perspective, they were dealing with a successful businessman who had suffered a severe head injury in what appeared to be an industrial accident. The fact that his amnesia was so selective, affecting only certain types of memories while leaving others intact, was unusual, but not unprecedented in cases of severe brain trauma. Spider-Man's discovery of the unconscious Norman Osborn lying among the wreckage of the Green Goblin's equipment created one of the most morally complex moments in the character's heroic career. Here was his greatest enemy, helpless and vulnerable, stripped of both his costume and his memories of their conflict. The temptation to simply unmask him and turn him over to the authorities must have been overwhelming, but Peter Parker's fundamental decency and moral principles prevented him from taking advantage of an opponent who was no longer capable of defending himself. The decision to burn the Green Goblin costume and destroy the evidence of Norman's criminal identity was motivated by a combination of compassion and pragmatic heroism that revealed the depth of Spider-Man's commitment to his moral principles. Rather than seeking revenge or justice in the traditional sense, Peter chose to give Norman an opportunity for redemption that the man himself could never have requested or earned. This act of mercy would have profound consequences for both characters, creating a cycle of guilt and responsibility that would complicate their relationship for years to come. The symbolism of the burning costume was powerful and multifaceted, representing not just the destruction of evidence, but the hope that Norman's criminal persona could be permanently eliminated, allowing the man underneath to reclaim his life and relationships. The flames that consumed the green and purple fabric seemed to offer the possibility of purification and renewal, suggesting that even the most corrupted individuals might be capable of redemption if given the chance. The hospital scenes that followed Norman's rescue revealed aspects of his character that had been largely hidden during his time as the Green Goblin, showing glimpses of the father and husband he had been before his transformation. His interactions with Harry during his recovery were marked by a gentleness and emotional availability that had been notably absent from their relationship in recent years, suggesting that the removal of the Goblin enhancement had restored some of his capacity for normal human connection. Harry's joy at having his father back, truly back in a way that he hadn't been for months or even years, was both touching and heartbreaking for readers who knew the truth about Norman's activities. The young man's relief at seeing his father showing genuine interest in his life and well-being highlighted just how much damage the Green Goblin persona had done to their family relationships, even before Norman had begun his criminal career. Norman's own confusion about his missing memories was portrayed with psychological realism, showing a man who knew that something significant had happened to him, but who was unable to access the experiences that might explain his current situation. His references to the past few years being forever buried and forever lost carried an ironic double meaning for readers who knew exactly what he was unable to remember and who understood that this forgetting might be the best possible outcome for everyone involved. The recovery period was characterized by what appeared to be genuine personality changes that suggested Norman's fundamental character had been improved by the removal of the chemical enhancements that had amplified his worst traits. His treatment of Harry became more patient and supportive. His business dealings became less ruthless and manipulative, and his general demeanor became more human and approachable. These changes raised the tantalizing possibility that the Norman Osborn who emerged from the hospital might be a genuinely better person than the one who had entered it. But the enhancement formula that had originally created the Green Goblin had made changes to Norman's brain chemistry that went deeper than simple personality alteration, and the electrical trauma that had caused his amnesia had not completely reversed those changes. The formula remained in his system, dormant but not destroyed, waiting for the right trigger to reactivate the neural pathways that connected him to his criminal persona. The gradual return of Norman's memories began with small, seemingly insignificant details that initially caused nothing more than mild confusion or momentary disorientation. A certain shade of green might cause an inexplicable moment of anxiety. The sight of someone in a spider-themed costume might trigger a flash of unreasonable anger, or the sound of mechanical whirring might produce a brief but intense feeling of excitement mixed with malevolence. These early warning signs were easily dismissed as after effects of his head injury, minor quirks that would presumably fade as his brain continued to heal. The trigger that would ultimately restore Norman's full memories came in the form of Captain George Stacy's well-intentioned educational seminar about supervillains, an event that was designed to help law enforcement personnel better understand the threats they might face in a world increasingly populated by costumed criminals and enhanced individuals. The seminar was thorough and professional, featuring detailed presentations about various villains' methods, capabilities, and psychological profiles. The slideshow presentation that featured images of the Green Goblin fighting Spider-Man was intended as nothing more than an educational tool, a way to familiarize police officers with the appearance and tactics of a dangerous criminal who might pose a threat to public safety. For most of the attendees, including Peter Parker, who was present in his civilian capacity as a photographer, the images were simply documentation of past events, historical records of battles that had already been fought and won. But for Norman Osborn, who had been invited to attend the seminar in his capacity as a prominent businessman with an interest in public safety issues, The images triggered a cascade of neurochemical reactions that began to restore the memories and personality changes that the electrochemical accident had temporarily suppressed. The visual stimuli acted like a key fitting into a lock, opening pathways in his brain that had been closed since his injury. The physical symptoms that Norman experienced during the presentation were subtle but significant. Increased heart rate, perspiration, dilated pupils, and a growing sense of excitement mixed with familiarity that he could not explain. To outside observers, he appeared to be suffering from nothing more than mild discomfort, or perhaps a headache brought on by the stress of viewing disturbing images. But internally, Norman was experiencing the first stirrings of a psychological awakening that would ultimately restore his complete memories of his time as the Green Goblin. The process of memory recovery was not instantaneous, but occurred over several days and nights, with fragments of his criminal past returning in dreams and waking visions that initially seemed like nightmares or hallucinations. Norman found himself remembering conversations he had never had, battles he had never fought, and emotions he had never felt, all connected to activities that seemed completely foreign to his current personality and moral framework. The night when Norman's memories fully returned was portrayed as a moment of both triumph and tragedy, as the man who had spent months rebuilding his relationship with his son and reclaiming his humanity suddenly found himself reconnected to a persona that embodied everything dark and destructive about his character. The moment of awakening was characterized by a mixture of relief at finally understanding what had happened to him and horror at the realization of what he had done while wearing the Goblin mask. The famous scene of Norman sitting up in bed with the sudden realization that the Green Goblin isn't dead. He never died. I am the Goblin represented one of the most dramatically effective moments in the entire series, capturing the precise instant when a man's better nature was overwhelmed by the return of his worst impulses. The psychological battle between Norman the father and Norman the Goblin was compressed into a single moment of terrible clarity. The restoration of the Green Goblin persona was not simply a matter of remembering past events, but of reconnecting with the enhanced intelligence, emotional detachment, and moral flexibility that the Goblin formula had originally created. Norman found himself once again capable of the kind of strategic thinking and ruthless planning that had made him such a formidable opponent. But now these capabilities were informed by months of experience living as a normal, caring human being. This combination of enhanced criminal capability with intimate knowledge of what he had lost by embracing his darker nature created a Green Goblin who was both more dangerous and more tragic than before. He understood exactly what his criminal activities cost him in terms of human relationships and personal happiness, but he found himself unable to resist the intoxicating appeal of the power and superiority that his Goblin identity provided. The resumption of his criminal activities was marked by an even more intense obsession with Spider-Man than before, as Norman now had the additional motivation of revenge against the hero who had temporarily robbed him of his enhanced identity. The months of enforced normalcy had not cured him of his megalomania, but had instead given him a new perspective on what he had lost and a burning desire to reclaim his position as one of New York's most feared criminals. The pattern of forgetting and remembering that characterized this period of Norman's life created a Jekyll and Hyde dynamic that was both psychologically compelling and narratively useful. During his periods of amnesia, Norman could be portrayed as a genuinely sympathetic character whose love for his family and commitment to legitimate business success made him almost heroic. During his periods of criminal activity, he became once again the calculating, ruthless villain who posed such a threat to Spider-Man and everyone connected to him. The toll that these cycles took on Norman's family relationships, particularly his bond with Harry, was devastating and long-lasting. Harry found himself caught between love for the father who appeared during Norman's periods of amnesia and fear of the stranger who took his place when the Green Goblin persona reasserted itself. The young man could never be certain which version of his father he would encounter on any given day, creating an atmosphere of uncertainty and anxiety that would affect his psychological development for years to come. The impact on Norman's marriage was similarly destructive, as his wife found herself living with a man whose personality could change dramatically without warning or explanation. The Norman who returned from the hospital had seemed like the answer to her prayers, a husband who was finally emotionally available and capable of genuine intimacy. The return of his Green Goblin memories transformed him once again into the cold, distant man she had married. But now with the added complication of periodic, unexplained absences and strange behavior that she could not understand. Spider-Man's awareness of Norman's condition created a complex moral dilemma that had no clear resolution. Peter knew that Norman Osborn and the Green Goblin were the same person, but he also knew that Norman's periods of amnesia represented genuine opportunities for redemption and rehabilitation. The question of whether to expose Norman's dual identity during his periods of apparent recovery was complicated by the potential consequences for Harry and the rest of the Osborn family. The psychological warfare that the Green Goblin employed during this period was enhanced by his intimate knowledge of how amnesia affected his relationship with his family and his understanding of how Spider-Man's moral principles prevented the hero from taking advantage of his condition. Norman began to use his periods of apparent normalcy as both cover for his criminal activities and as psychological weapons against his enemy. The manipulation of his own family relationships became another tool in the Green Goblin's arsenal, as he learned to time his criminal activities to coincide with periods when his apparent recovery would make him seem least likely to be involved in illegal activities. This cynical exploitation of his family's love and hope for his recovery represented a new low in his moral degradation, showing how completely his criminal persona had corrupted his capacity for genuine human connection. The medical and psychiatric community's inability to understand or effectively treat Norman's condition reflected the limitations of conventional approaches to mental health in dealing with cases that involved supernatural or science-fictional elements. The doctors who examined Norman during his periods of apparent recovery found nothing wrong with him beyond the residual effects of his original head injury, while his criminal activities during his Goblin phases seemed to indicate either a complete personality disorder or elaborate deception. The broader implications of Norman's condition for the question of criminal responsibility and mental competency were complex and troubling. During his periods of amnesia, Norman was genuinely unable to remember or accept responsibility for his criminal activities, while during his periods of criminal activity, he was fully aware of his actions, but operating under the influence of chemical enhancements that had altered his brain chemistry and moral reasoning capabilities. As the cycles of memory loss and recovery continued, they began to take an increasing toll on Norman's physical and mental health, creating stress fractures in his psyche that would eventually lead to even more dramatic and destructive developments. The constant switching between different versions of his identity prevented him from achieving any kind of psychological stability or genuine personal growth, trapping him in a pattern of behavior that was ultimately self-destructive. The tragedy of Norman Osborn during this period was that glimpses of the man he could have been continued to emerge during his periods of recovery, showing that underneath the criminal persona, there remained a human being capable of love, growth, and redemption. But these glimpses only served to make his inevitable return to criminality more heartbreaking, and his impact on his family more devastating, creating a cycle of hope and disappointment that would define the Osborn family dynamic for years to come. The night Gwen Stacy died represents the most devastating and consequential moment in Spider-Man's entire history. A tragedy that transformed not just Peter Parker's understanding of heroism and responsibility, but the very nature of superhero storytelling itself. What began as another confrontation between Spider-Man and the Green Goblin evolved into a moment of such profound loss and moral complexity that its reverberations would be felt throughout the Marvel Universe for decades to come. The events leading up to that fateful night had been building for months. As Norman Osborn's latest return to his Green Goblin identity had been marked by an escalating pattern of psychological warfare and increasingly personal attacks on Peter Parker's civilian life. The cyclical nature of Norman's amnesia and recovery had given him insights into Spider-Man's psychology and personal relationships that he had never possessed before, allowing him to craft strategies that struck at the very heart of what mattered most to his enemy. Gwen Stacy had become central to Peter Parker's civilian happiness in ways that went far beyond simple romantic attraction. She represented hope for a normal future, the possibility that he might someday be able to balance his responsibilities as Spider-Man with the ordinary human desires for love, companionship, and domestic contentment. Her presence in his life had given him something precious to protect and something beautiful to fight for, making his heroic activities feel less like a burden and more like a calling. But Gwen's importance to Peter also made her a perfect target for an enemy who understood that the most effective way to hurt a hero was not through direct physical confrontation, but through the systematic destruction of everything that gave his life meaning and purpose. The Green Goblin had learned through careful observation and bitter experience that Spider-Man's greatest strength was also his greatest weakness. His overwhelming need to protect the innocent people who had the misfortune to be connected to his dual existence. The kidnapping of Gwen Stacy was not a spontaneous act of violence, but the culmination of weeks of planning and preparation. As Norman carefully studied her daily routines, her security arrangements, and her relationship patterns, the Green Goblin's approach to this operation demonstrated the same methodical precision that had characterized his previous schemes, but now informed by a personal hatred that made his actions even more calculated and cruel. The method of Gwen's abduction was designed to maximize both its practical effectiveness and its psychological impact on Spider-Man. Rather than simply overpowering her through superior strength or technology, the Green Goblin chose to use stealth and surprise, striking when she was most vulnerable and least likely to be protected by Spider-Man's constant vigilance. The timing and location were chosen to ensure that Peter would discover her disappearance in a way that would generate maximum guilt and desperation. The message that the Green Goblin left for Spider-Man was crafted with the same attention to psychological detail that characterized all of his most effective attacks. Rather than simply announcing his intentions or making demands, Norman chose words that would resonate with Peter's deepest fears and insecurities, playing on his guilt about the dangers that his double life created for the people he loved. The message was designed not just to inform but to torment, to plant seeds of self-doubt that would affect Spider-Man's judgment during their inevitable confrontation. The choice of the George Washington Bridge as the location for their final battle was symbolically perfect, representing both the connection between different parts of Peter's world and the precarious balance between his dual identities. Bridges had always been significant locations in Spider-Man's adventures, representing transitions and choices, moments when the hero had to decide which direction his life would take. The bridge where Gwen would die became the ultimate symbol of this theme, the place where Peter's two worlds collided with tragic consequences. The Green Goblin's positioning of Gwen on the bridge was calculated to create an impossible tactical situation for Spider-Man, forcing him to divide his attention between protecting an innocent victim and defending himself against a dangerous enemy. Norman understood that Peter's protective instincts would make him predictable and vulnerable, that his need to save Gwen would override his strategic thinking and force him into making desperate choices that could be exploited. The height of the bridge and the distance of the fall were factors that the Green Goblin had undoubtedly calculated with scientific precision, understanding exactly how much time Spider-Man would have to react and what his options would be for attempting a rescue. Every aspect of the scenario was designed to create a situation where even Spider-Man's enhanced abilities and heroic determination might not be sufficient to prevent tragedy. The confrontation itself unfolded with the kind of dramatic inevitability that characterizes the greatest tragedies, as both participants found themselves locked into roles that seemed to offer no possibility of compromise or alternative resolution. The Green Goblin was driven by his need to prove his superiority over Spider-Man through the most personal and devastating victory possible, while Spider-Man was motivated by his desperate determination to save the woman he loved and to prevent his greatest enemy from claiming another innocent victim. The psychological warfare that characterized their battle was as intense as the physical combat, with Norman taunting Peter about his inability to protect the people he cared about, and his failure to permanently stop the Green Goblin's criminal activities. These attacks were designed to destabilize Spider-Man emotionally and mentally, to make him angry and reckless in ways that would compromise his effectiveness as both a fighter and a rescuer. Spider-Man's responses to the Green Goblin's taunts revealed the depth of his emotional investment in Gwen's safety and his growing desperation as the situation continued to deteriorate. His usual wit and verbal sparring were replaced by genuine anger and fear, emotions that made him more dangerous as an opponent, but also more likely to make critical mistakes at crucial moments. The hero who had always relied on his ability to think clearly under pressure found himself operating on pure instinct and overwhelming emotion. The moment when the Green Goblin finally pushed Gwen from the bridge was portrayed with the kind of slow-motion clarity that accompanies moments of extreme crisis, when time seems to stretch and every detail becomes hyper-visible and significant. The image of her falling body against the backdrop of the bridge's massive structure became one of the most iconic and heartbreaking visuals in comic book history, capturing the precise instant when heroism failed and tragedy became inevitable. Spider-Man's desperate attempt to save Gwen with his web shooters was both heroically determined and tragically flawed, demonstrating the limitations that even the most well-intentioned heroic actions could face when confronted with the laws of physics and the realities of human fragility. His web line reached her in time to prevent her from hitting the water far below, but the sudden stop created forces that her body simply could not withstand. The sound that accompanied Gwen's death, the terrible snap that indicated the breaking of her neck, became known among comic book fans as the snap heard round the world, a moment that marked the end of the Silver Age's optimistic assumption that heroes could always save everyone if they were just fast enough, strong enough, or heroic enough. The sound represented the intrusion of real-world consequences into the fantasy realm of superhero comics, a reminder that some mistakes could never be undone and some losses could never be recovered. Spider-Man's realization that his rescue attempt had failed, that his own actions had contributed to Gwen's death, created a moment of psychological trauma that would affect his character for the rest of his heroic career. The guilt and self-doubt that had always been part of Peter Parker's personality were suddenly magnified beyond anything he had previously experienced, as he was forced to confront the possibility that his attempts to help sometimes made situations worse rather than better. The Green Goblin's reaction to Gwen's death revealed the complex mixture of triumph and horror that characterized his relationship with his own actions. On one level, he had achieved exactly what he had set out to accomplish, dealing Spider-Man a devastating blow that would haunt him for the rest of his life. But on another level, Even Norman's enhanced and corrupted psyche was disturbed by the sight of an innocent young woman dying as a result of his schemes. The immediate aftermath of Gwen's death was characterized by a silence that seemed to stretch across the entire city, a moment of stillness in which both hero and villain had to absorb the magnitude of what had just occurred. The usual banter and dramatic declarations that accompanied their battles were replaced by a stunned quiet that acknowledged the crossing of a line that could never be uncrossed. The commission of an act that transformed their conflict from elaborate game to genuine tragedy. Spider-Man's grief quickly transformed into a rage, unlike anything he had ever experienced, a fury that burned away his usual restraint and moral limitations in favor of a primitive desire for revenge that shocked him with its intensity. The hero who had always prided himself on his ability to maintain his humanity, even in the most extreme circumstances, found himself consumed by emotions that threatened to transform him into something very different from what he had always believed himself to be. The pursuit of the Green Goblin that followed became less a heroic attempt to apprehend a criminal than a hunt motivated by the desire for vengeance, as Spider-Man's enhanced abilities were finally unleashed without the moral constraints that had always limited their application. The speed and intensity of his attacks surprised even Norman, who had never before faced Spider-Man operating at full capacity, without holding back to avoid seriously injuring his opponents. The alley where their final battle took place became a crucible in which both characters were tested to their absolute limits, forced to confront not just each other, but the darkest aspects of their own natures. For Spider-Man, the fight represented a struggle between his desire for revenge and his commitment to the heroic ideals that had always guided his actions. For the Green Goblin, it represented a confrontation with the consequences of his actions and the reality of facing an opponent who was no longer constrained by mercy or restraint. Spider-Man's declaration that he had loved Gwen and that the Green Goblin had taken her away from him was both a statement of loss and a promise of retribution, words that carried with them the weight of genuine anguish and the threat of lethal consequences. The profanity and raw emotion in his voice were unlike anything readers had ever heard from the typically quip-making hero, marking a fundamental change in his character that would persist long after the immediate crisis had passed. The beating that Spider-Man administered to the Green Goblin was portrayed with an unflinching realism that made it clear how close the hero had come to crossing the line between justice and murder, between heroic determination and criminal vengeance. The systematic nature of the assault, the cold calculation with which each blow was delivered, and the obvious satisfaction that Peter felt at causing his enemy pain, all demonstrated how completely his grief had overwhelmed his moral principles. The moment when Spider-Man realized what he was doing and pulled back from the brink of murder represented one of the most crucial, character-defining moments in his entire history, a test of his fundamental values that he ultimately passed, but only barely. His recognition that killing the Green Goblin would make him no better than the villain he was fighting forced him to confront the true nature of heroism and the price that maintaining one's principles sometimes demanded. The Green Goblin's final gambit, his attempt to use his glider to impale Spider-Man from behind while pretending to be helpless and defeated, demonstrated the complete absence of honor or fairness that characterized his approach to their conflict. Even facing apparent death, Norman chose to attempt one last act of treachery rather than accepting defeat or showing any remorse for the tragedy he had caused. Spider-Man's spider sense warning him of the approaching glider created a moment of perfect dramatic irony, as the same enhanced reflexes that had failed to save Gwen Stacy now saved his own life from the Green Goblin's final attack. The hero's quick dodge transformed Norman's intended moment of triumph into his own destruction. as the glider that was meant to kill Spider-Man instead impaled its own operator with mechanical precision. The death of Norman Osborn was portrayed as both inevitable and tragic, the logical consequence of a life devoted to hatred and revenge, but also the loss of a human being who had once been capable of love and creation. The man who died in that alley was not just the Green Goblin, but also Harry's father, a brilliant scientist, and someone who had once shown glimpses of genuine humanity during his periods of amnesia and recovery. The immediate aftermath of Norman's death was characterized by a complex mixture of emotions that reflected the psychological realism that had always distinguished Spider-Man's stories from simpler heroic narratives. Peter felt relief that the threat was ended, satisfaction that justice had been served, guilt about his role in causing the death, and overwhelming grief about the loss that had precipitated the entire tragedy. The discovery of Norman's body by the authorities created immediate complications for Spider-Man, as the death of such a prominent businessman under mysterious circumstances was bound to generate intense media attention and official investigation. The hero's decision to leave the scene without providing explanations or testimony reflected both his need to protect his secret identity and his understanding that the full truth of the situation could never be publicly revealed. The impact of Gwen's death on Peter's relationship with her father, Captain George Stacy, added another layer of complexity to an already tragic situation. The older man's grief over losing his daughter was compounded by his inability to understand the circumstances of her death or to find anyone who could be held accountable for the tragedy. His relationship with Peter became strained by secrets that could never be shared and explanations that could never be given. The broader implications of Gwen's death for the Marvel Universe were profound and lasting, marking the end of the Silver Age's optimistic assumption that heroic intentions and noble purposes were sufficient to ensure positive outcomes. The tragedy demonstrated that even the most dedicated heroes could fail in their most important missions, and that some consequences could never be prevented or undone regardless of good intentions or heroic determination. The psychological impact on Peter Parker was immediate and devastating, transforming his understanding of what it meant to be a hero and forcing him to confront the possibility that his dual life created dangers for innocent people that might outweigh the benefits of his heroic activities. The guilt and self-doubt that resulted from Gwen's death would color every subsequent relationship and heroic action, creating a burden of responsibility that went far beyond anything he had previously experienced. The legacy of that terrible night would extend far beyond the immediate participants, influencing the tone and themes of Spider-Man stories for decades to come, while also affecting the broader direction of superhero comics as they moved away from the innocent optimism of earlier eras toward more complex and morally ambiguous narratives. The night Gwen Stacy died became a watershed moment that marked the transition from the Silver Age to the Bronze Age of comics, a change that reflected broader cultural shifts toward greater realism and moral complexity in popular entertainment. As the immediate crisis ended and the long process of grief and recovery began, Peter Parker found himself forever changed by the events of that night, carrying with him not just the memory of his failure to save the woman he loved, but also the knowledge that heroism sometimes demanded prices that seemed too high to pay, yet had to be paid nonetheless. The snap that had ended Gwen's life had also shattered forever the illusion that good intentions and heroic abilities were sufficient to prevent all tragedies, leaving behind a hero who was wiser but more burdened, more experienced, but less optimistic about the possibility of protecting everyone he cared about from the dangers that his double life inevitably created. The transformation of Harry Osborn from grieving son to vengeful Green Goblin represents one of the most tragic and psychologically complex character arcs in comic book history. a descent into madness that was both inevitable, given his circumstances, and heartbreaking in its systematic destruction of everything that had once made him a sympathetic and likable character. The seeds of his eventual breakdown had been planted years earlier through his father's neglect and emotional abuse, but it was the discovery of Norman's dual identity that finally shattered whatever psychological stability he had managed to maintain. Harry's drug problems had begun during his college years as a response to the mounting pressure he felt to live up to his father's impossible expectations and his own deep-seated feelings of inadequacy and worthlessness. The substances he initially experimented with were typical of what might be found on any college campus during the late 1960s: marijuana, amphetamines, and various prescription medications that were readily available through both legitimate and illegitimate channels. But what had started as recreational experimentation quickly evolved into something more serious and self-destructive, as Harry discovered that drugs provided temporary relief from the anxiety and depression that had plagued him throughout his adolescence. The chemical escape they offered was seductive and seemingly harmless compared to the constant emotional turmoil that characterized his sober existence, making it easy to rationalize increasing usage as a reasonable response to unreasonable circumstances. The progression from occasional recreational use to serious dependency was gradual but relentless, following the familiar pattern that has destroyed so many promising young lives throughout history. Each dose provided temporary relief from his psychological pain, but the underlying problems that had driven him to seek chemical escape remained unresolved and actually worsened as his drug use began to affect his academic performance, personal relationships, and emotional stability. Peter Parker's attempts to help his friend during this period were complicated by his own secret identity and the demands of his Spider-Man activities, which often prevented him from being as available and supportive as Harry needed. The irony of the situation was lost on both young men at the time. Harry was destroying himself, partly because of his father's activities as the Green Goblin, while Peter was unable to provide adequate help because of his responsibilities as Spider-Man, creating a vicious cycle in which the superhero conflict poisoned civilian relationships in ways that neither participant could fully understand. Harry's relationship with his father during this period was characterized by Norman's typical mixture of disappointment, criticism, and emotional unavailability, made worse by the older man's increasing absorption in his Green Goblin activities. Norman saw his son's drug problems as evidence of weakness and moral failure rather than as symptoms of deeper psychological issues that required understanding and professional treatment. His response was to increase pressure and criticism rather than providing the emotional support and unconditional love that Harry desperately needed. The discovery of his father's secret identity came not through any deliberate investigation or heroic revelation, but through the kind of accidental observation that often occurs when people live in close proximity to each other for extended periods. Harry's familiarity with his father's habits and behavior patterns made it possible for him to notice subtle changes and inconsistencies that would have been invisible to outsiders, creating a gradual awareness that something significant was being hidden from him. The physical evidence of Norman's double life was scattered throughout the Osborn household in ways that were carefully concealed from casual observation but visible to someone who knew where to look and what to look for. Chemical stains on clothing, unusual injuries that were explained as business-related accidents, and strange equipment that appeared and disappeared from Norman's private laboratory all contributed to Harry's growing suspicion that his father was involved in activities that went far beyond legitimate corporate research. The psychological impact of discovering that his father was the Green Goblin was devastating in ways that went far beyond simple shock or disappointment. For Harry, the revelation recontextualized his entire childhood and adolescence, forcing him to reinterpret years of neglect, criticism, and emotional abuse in light of his father's criminal activities and enhanced psychological state. The father, who had always seemed distant and emotionally unavailable, was revealed to be actively involved in activities that made such distance not just understandable, but necessary for everyone's safety. But perhaps even more disturbing for Harry was the realization that his father's greatest enemy was his own best friend, Peter Parker, creating a conflict of loyalties that seemed to have no possible resolution. The discovery that Spider-Man and Peter were the same person came as part of the same terrible revelation, transforming Harry's understanding of both his family relationships and his friendships in ways that left him feeling betrayed and manipulated by everyone he had trusted. The decision to become the second Green Goblin was not made impulsively or in a moment of sudden inspiration, but evolved gradually as Harry processed the implications of what he had learned and struggled to find some way to make sense of his father's death and his own place in the ongoing conflict between the Osborn and Parker families. The Goblin identity offered him both a way to honor his father's memory and a means of expressing the rage and resentment that had been building inside him for years. The psychological mechanisms that drove Harry's transformation were complex and multifaceted, involving elements of grief, guilt, anger, and a desperate need to prove himself worthy of his father's approval even after Norman's death. The Green Goblin persona represented everything that Norman had valued: intelligence, power, strategic thinking, and the willingness to take whatever actions were necessary to achieve one's goals regardless of conventional moral constraints. Harry's initial attempts to assume the Green Goblin identity were marked by a combination of determination and incompetence that reflected both his genuine desire to succeed in his father's footsteps and his lack of the enhanced intelligence and physical capabilities that had made Norman such a formidable opponent. The Goblin formula that had transformed his father was not immediately available to him, forcing him to rely on his own natural abilities and whatever equipment he could salvage or reconstruct from Norman's hidden laboratories. The psychological profile that emerged during Harry's early activities as the Green Goblin revealed a young man who was simultaneously trying to live up to his father's example and rebel against his father's treatment of him. His attacks on Spider-Man were motivated by genuine hatred and desire for revenge, but they were also attempts to prove that he was not the weak, disappointing son that Norman had always believed him to be. The development of Harry's criminal capabilities was hampered by his drug dependency, which affected both his judgment and his physical coordination in ways that made him less effective as both a strategist and a combatant. The chemical substances that he used to escape from psychological pain also impaired his ability to think clearly and plan effectively, creating a self-reinforcing cycle in which his failures as the Green Goblin drove him to increased substance abuse, which in turn made future failures more likely. Spider-Man's recognition that his new enemy was his former best friend created one of the most emotionally complex and morally challenging situations in his entire heroic career. Peter's desire to help Harry overcome his problems was complicated by the need to protect himself and innocent bystanders from the young man's increasingly dangerous and unpredictable attacks. The knowledge that Harry's descent into criminality was partly a result of trauma caused by Peter's conflict with Norman made the situation even more psychologically difficult for the web-slinging hero. The battles between Spider-Man and the second Green Goblin were characterized by an underlying sadness and reluctance that distinguished them from the intense hatred that had marked the conflicts with Norman. Peter's attempts to reason with Harry and appeal to their former friendship were met with increasingly bitter responses that demonstrated how completely Harry's perception of their relationship had been poisoned by his discovery of Peter's secret identity and his role in Norman's death. Harry's psychological torture of Spider-Man went beyond simple physical combat to include systematic attacks on Peter's civilian relationships and attempts to undermine his sense of self-worth and moral authority. These attacks were informed by intimate knowledge of Peter's personality and vulnerabilities gained through years of friendship, making them far more effective and personally devastating than anything that could have been devised by a stranger. The collaboration with the chameleon that led to the cruel deception involving Peter's supposedly deceased parents represented the nadir of Harry's moral degradation, demonstrating how completely his need for revenge had overridden any remaining traces of human decency or compassion. The elaborate scheme required months of planning and preparation, involving detailed psychological manipulation designed to give Peter hope before snatching it away in the most painful manner possible. The fake reunion with Peter's parents was crafted with diabolical attention to detail, taking advantage of Peter's deepest longings and most fundamental emotional needs to create a scenario that would cause maximum psychological damage when the truth was finally revealed. Harry's ability to maintain the deception for an extended period demonstrated both his growing strategic sophistication and his complete abandonment of the moral principles that had once made him a genuinely good person. The revelation that Peter's parents were actually android duplicates created by the chameleon was delivered with calculated cruelty, designed to maximize Peter's sense of betrayal and emotional devastation. Harry's satisfaction at seeing his former friend's pain revealed how completely his grief and anger had corrupted his capacity for empathy and human connection, transforming him from a victim of circumstances into a genuine monster, capable of inflicting terrible suffering on innocent people. The aftermath of the parents' deception marked a turning point in Harry's criminal career, as he finally achieved the kind of devastating victory over Spider-Man that had eluded his father for years. But rather than providing the satisfaction and sense of accomplishment that he had expected, the success left him feeling empty and more psychologically damaged than before, as he realized that revenge could not actually heal the wounds that had driven him to seek it. The internal struggle that Harry experienced between his desire for vengeance and his remaining traces of affection for Peter created a psychological tension that manifested itself in increasingly erratic and unpredictable behavior. His attacks on Spider-Man became more personal and more cruel, but they were also marked by moments of hesitation and apparent regret that suggested the presence of conflicted feelings that he was unable to acknowledge or resolve. The periods of apparent friendship and normalcy that occasionally characterized Harry's interactions with Peter during this time were particularly heartbreaking, because they offered glimpses of the person he might have been under different circumstances. These moments of genuine human connection demonstrated that the capacity for redemption still existed within him, but they were increasingly overwhelmed by the accumulated weight of his psychological damage and chemical dependency. Harry's relationship with his father's memory was complex and contradictory, involving simultaneous idealization and resentment that reflected his confused feelings about Norman's role in his life. He wanted to honor his father's legacy and prove himself worthy of Norman's approval, but he also blamed his father for the emotional neglect and psychological abuse that had contributed to his current problems. This internal conflict created a psychological instability that made it impossible for him to develop a coherent sense of identity or purpose. The Goblin formula that Harry eventually obtained and used represented both the culmination of his efforts to match his father's capabilities and the final step in his transformation from troubled young man to genuinely dangerous criminal. The chemical enhancement provided him with the physical strength and mental acuity that had made Norman such a formidable opponent, but it also amplified his existing psychological problems and moral deficiencies in ways that made him even more unpredictable and destructive. The enhanced Harry was more dangerous than his father had ever been because his criminal activities were motivated not by megalomaniacal ambitions or strategic goals, but by pure emotional pain and the desperate need to make others suffer as he had suffered. His attacks on Spider-Man and innocent bystanders were informed by intimate knowledge of what would cause maximum psychological damage rather than what would achieve practical criminal objectives. The tragic irony of Harry's situation was that his transformation into the Green Goblin was both a rebellion against his father's treatment of him and a complete capitulation to his father's values and methods. By embracing the Goblin identity, Harry was simultaneously rejecting Norman's criticism of his weakness and accepting Norman's belief that strength was measured by the willingness to hurt others and that success justified any means necessary to achieve it. The cycle of violence and revenge that characterized Harry's activities as the Green Goblin represented a continuation of the destructive patterns that had defined the Osborn family for generations, demonstrating how psychological damage and moral corruption could be passed from one generation to the next through modeling and reinforcement. Harry's criminal career was not just a product of his own choices, but the inevitable result of decades of dysfunction and abuse that had shaped his understanding of how relationships worked and what it meant to be strong. The moments of clarity and apparent recovery that occasionally interrupted Harry's descent into madness were particularly poignant because they demonstrated his awareness of what he was becoming and his genuine desire to change, even though he seemed unable to break free from the patterns of thought and behavior that were destroying his life. These glimpses of self-awareness made his continued criminal activities even more tragic, because they showed that his transformation was not the result of genuine evil, but of psychological damage that might have been treatable under different circumstances. As Harry's tenure as the Green Goblin continued, the toll of his activities on his physical and mental health became increasingly apparent, with his drug dependency and the side effects of the Goblin formula creating a downward spiral that threatened to destroy whatever remained of his humanity. The young man who had once been Peter Parker's best friend was disappearing beneath layers of chemical enhancement and psychological dysfunction, replaced by something that was simultaneously more and less than human. The legacy of Harry Osborn's time as the Green Goblin would extend far beyond his own eventual fate, influencing the tone and themes of Spider-Man stories for decades, while also serving as a cautionary tale about the long-term consequences of psychological abuse and the way that cycles of violence can perpetuate themselves. Across generations, his story demonstrated that victims could become victimizers, and that good people could become monsters when subjected to enough pain and manipulation, making his tale both a tragedy and a warning about the importance of breaking destructive patterns before they could claim another generation. The revelation that Norman Osborn had survived his apparent death and orchestrated the entire clone saga from behind the shadows represents one of the most ambitious and controversial storylines in Spider-Man's publishing history, a narrative gambit that fundamentally altered readers' understanding of Peter Parker's life, while raising profound questions about identity, memory, and the nature of heroic responsibility. The scope and complexity of Norman's long-term manipulation was so vast that it took years for the full implications to be understood, transforming what had seemed like separate storylines into interconnected elements of a single devastating master plan. The physical mechanism of Norman's survival was both scientifically plausible within the Marvel Universe and psychologically consistent with his character's combination of paranoid preparation and megalomaniacal arrogance. The healing factor that had been enhanced by the Goblin formula had proven more powerful than anyone, including Norman himself, had initially realized, allowing his body to recover from injuries that would have been fatal to normal humans, while his consciousness remained dormant during the extended healing process. The years of apparent death had actually been spent in a state that was neither truly alive nor completely dead, as Norman's enhanced physiology worked to repair the massive trauma inflicted by his own glider, while his consciousness remained submerged beneath layers of chemical-induced coma and cellular regeneration. During this time, his body was sustained by loyal Oscorp employees who understood the potential value of their employer's eventual recovery and who maintained the medical equipment necessary to support his biological functions. The awakening process was gradual and painful, as Norman's consciousness slowly reasserted itself over a body that had been fundamentally altered by years of chemical enhancement and traumatic recovery. His memories of the events leading up to his apparent death were initially fragmented and confused, but they gradually coalesced into a clear understanding of what had happened and a burning desire for revenge against the man who had been responsible for his ordeal. But Norman's approach to revenge was informed by the same strategic thinking and long-term planning that had made him such a formidable opponent in the past, enhanced by years of forced reflection and the accumulated wisdom that came from having survived what should have been a fatal encounter. Rather than immediately resuming his Green Goblin identity and launching direct attacks against Spider-Man, he chose to remain hidden while constructing an elaborate scheme that would destroy his enemy's life piece by piece. The decision to orchestrate the Clone Saga was brilliant in its psychological sophistication and devastating in its personal impact on Peter Parker's sense of identity and belonging. Norman understood that the most effective way to destroy a hero was not through physical defeat, but through the systematic elimination of everything that gave his life meaning and purpose, starting with his most fundamental understanding of who and what he was. The creation of multiple clones of Peter Parker was technologically complex but psychologically simple in its motivation. Norman wanted to force his enemy to question his own reality and authenticity while simultaneously providing himself with multiple opportunities to manipulate and torment different versions of the same person. The clones were not just biological curiosities, but weapons designed to attack Spider-Man's sense of self and his confidence in his own memories and experiences. Ben Reilly, the clone who would become known as the Scarlet Spider, and later claimed to be the original Peter Parker, was perhaps the most sophisticated and cruel element of Norman's plan. Ben was given memories that were identical to Peter's up to the point of the original cloning experiment, making it impossible for either man to definitively prove which of them was the original and which was the copy. This uncertainty created a psychological torture that was more effective than any physical punishment could have been. The years that Ben spent wandering the country, believing himself to be a clone and struggling with questions about his own identity and purpose, were exactly what Norman had intended when he set his plan in motion. Every moment of loneliness and self-doubt that Ben experienced was a victory for Norman's long-term strategy of psychological warfare, proof that his revenge could extend far beyond the immediate target to encompass multiple lives and generations of suffering. The manipulation of scientific evidence and DNA testing that allowed Ben to apparently prove his claim to be the original Peter Parker was a masterpiece of misdirection and technological expertise that demonstrated Norman's ability to corrupt even the most objective forms of verification. The false results were not simply fabricated, but were based on actual biological alterations that Norman had made to both clones during their creation, ensuring that the deception would withstand even the most sophisticated scientific scrutiny. Peter Parker's psychological response to the revelation that he might be a clone rather than the original person whose memories he possessed represented one of the most complex and emotionally devastating challenges he had ever faced. The identity crisis went far beyond simple questions of biological authenticity to encompass fundamental issues of moral responsibility, emotional validity, and the nature of human consciousness itself. The period during which Peter believed himself to be the clone was marked by a gradual erosion of his confidence and self-worth that affected every aspect of his life, from his relationships with friends and family to his effectiveness as Spider-Man. If he was not the original Peter Parker, then were his memories of Uncle Ben real? Did his marriage to Mary Jane have any authentic foundation? Was his entire heroic career based on borrowed experiences and inherited obligations rather than genuine personal choice? Norman's manipulation of the clone saga extended far beyond the creation of the clones themselves, to include careful orchestration of the circumstances under which they would encounter each other and the emotional context that would make their identity crisis as painful as possible. Every reunion, every revelation, and every moment of doubt was planned and timed to maximize the psychological impact on all parties involved. The involvement of the Jackal in the cloning experiments provided Norman with both a scientific collaborator and a convenient scapegoat who could be blamed for the more obviously unethical aspects of the project. Miles Warren's own obsession with Gwen Stacy and his descent into madness made him the perfect unwitting accomplice for Norman's schemes, someone whose own psychological damage made him easy to manipulate while his scientific expertise made him genuinely useful. The years of planning and preparation that went into the clone saga demonstrated Norman's patience and strategic thinking on a scale that dwarfed his previous schemes, showing how his apparent death had taught him the value of long-term manipulation over immediate gratification. Every element of the plan was designed to serve multiple purposes, creating layers of deception and misdirection that would make it difficult for his enemies to understand the true scope of what was happening until it was too late to prevent. The psychological profiles that Norman developed of Peter Parker and his supporting cast during his years of hidden observation were more detailed and accurate than anything he had possessed during his original tenure as the Green Goblin, giving him unprecedented insights into their motivations, fears, and vulnerabilities. This knowledge allowed him to craft attacks that were perfectly calibrated to cause maximum emotional damage while maintaining the appearance of natural consequences rather than deliberate manipulation. The corruption of Peter's relationships with his friends and family was achieved through subtle manipulation and the introduction of doubt rather than through direct confrontation or obvious interference. Norman understood that the most effective way to destroy someone's support network was to make them question the authenticity and reliability of their own connections, creating paranoia and suspicion that would isolate his target more effectively than any external threat could manage. The timing of Norman's eventual revelation as the mastermind behind the clone saga was carefully chosen to coincide with the moment when Peter's psychological defenses were at their lowest and his capacity for resistance was most compromised. The appearance of the man who was supposed to be dead at the precise moment when Peter had accepted his identity as a clone was designed to create a shock so profound that it would shatter whatever remained of his emotional stability. The manner in which Norman chose to reveal himself demonstrated his understanding of theatrical psychology and his appreciation for the dramatic impact of perfectly timed revelations. Rather than simply appearing and announcing his survival, he orchestrated a series of encounters that gradually built toward the ultimate revelation, allowing Peter's hope and despair to cycle through multiple iterations before delivering the final devastating blow. Norman's explanation of how he had survived the glider impalement and orchestrated the years of manipulation that followed was delivered with characteristic arrogance and satisfaction, demonstrating his pleasure at having successfully deceived everyone while accomplishing the most comprehensive destruction of an enemy's life that had ever been attempted. The revelation was not just about exposing his survival, but about claiming credit for every moment of suffering that Peter had experienced during the intervening years. The scope of Norman's manipulation extended beyond the immediate participants in the Clone Saga to encompass the entire supporting cast of Spider-Man's world, as friends and enemies alike had been unknowingly manipulated into playing roles in his elaborate revenge scheme. The realization that years of apparently independent events had actually been coordinated by a single malevolent intelligence was almost more shocking than the revelation of Norman's survival itself. The psychological impact of learning that his entire life had been under observation and manipulation by his greatest enemy created a form of trauma that went beyond anything Peter had previously experienced, challenging not just his understanding of recent events, but his confidence in his ability to trust his own perceptions and judgments. The paranoia and self-doubt that resulted from this revelation would affect his relationships and decision-making for years to come. The restoration of Peter's understanding of his own identity as the original, rather than a clone, provided some measure of psychological relief, but it also carried with it the burden of knowing how completely he had been deceived and manipulated by an enemy he had believed to be dead. The knowledge that Norman had been watching and planning throughout all the years when Peter thought he was safe created a sense of violation that was almost as devastating as the original identity crisis. The broader implications of Norman's survival and the revelation of his role in the Clone Saga extended throughout the entire Marvel universe, as other heroes and organizations were forced to reconsider their own security measures and assumptions about dead enemies. The precedent of such an elaborate long-term deception raised questions about the reliability of death itself as a final resolution to ongoing conflicts between heroes and villains. The methods that Norman had used to maintain his hidden influence over events during his apparent death demonstrated a level of organizational sophistication and resource management that exceeded anything he had displayed during his original criminal career. The network of loyal employees, hidden assets, and backup plans that he had maintained showed how his years of forced inactivity had been spent in careful preparation for his eventual return to active criminality. The psychological profile that emerged from Norman's orchestration of the Clone Saga revealed a mind that had been further corrupted and enhanced by his experience of apparent death and resurrection, creating a version of the Green Goblin that was more patient, more strategic, and more comprehensively evil than anything he had been before his supposed demise. The combination of enhanced intelligence, unlimited resources, and years of accumulated hatred had produced a villain of unprecedented capability and malevolence. The revelation that Ben Reilly had been manipulated and deceived from the moment of his creation added another layer of tragedy to a storyline that was already saturated with psychological damage and betrayed trust. Ben's genuine heroism and moral development during his years as a wandering clone made his ultimate fate even more heartbreaking, demonstrating how Norman's evil could corrupt and destroy even the most well-intentioned efforts at redemption and moral growth. The impact of Norman's return on Harry Osborn's legacy and the broader Osborn family dynamic was complex and disturbing, as it became clear that the psychological damage that had driven Harry to become the second Green Goblin had been orchestrated by the very father whose approval he had desperately sought. The revelation added another dimension to the tragedy of Harry's life and death, showing how Norman's manipulation had extended even to his own son's psychological destruction. As the full scope of Norman's survival and manipulation became clear, Peter Parker found himself facing not just the return of his greatest enemy, but the realization that his entire adult life had been shaped by that enemy's hidden influence in ways that could never be fully understood or undone. The master manipulator had returned from apparent death to claim credit for years of suffering, and to demonstrate that even death itself was not sufficient to escape the reach of his malevolence and strategic planning. The transformation of Norman Osborn from criminal mastermind into a figure of legitimate governmental authority represents one of the most audacious and psychologically complex storylines in Marvel Comics history, a narrative arc that explored the terrifying possibility that society's greatest threats might come not from obvious villains operating outside the system, but from corrupt individuals who managed to seize control of the very institutions designed to protect the innocent. Norman's ascension to power during the Dark Reign era was both a culmination of his lifelong ambitions and a perversion of everything that heroism was meant to represent. The foundation for Norman's eventual rise to power was laid during his involvement with the Thunderbolts program, a government initiative designed to rehabilitate supervillains by placing them under official supervision and giving them opportunities to perform heroic acts under controlled circumstances. The program represented a progressive approach to criminal justice that recognized the potential for redemption even among the most dangerous individuals, but it also created opportunities for manipulation that someone with Norman's intelligence and strategic thinking could exploit with devastating effectiveness. Norman's initial participation in the Thunderbolts was portrayed as a genuine attempt at rehabilitation, complete with psychological counseling, supervised missions, and regular evaluations of his mental health and commitment to reform. To outside observers, including the government officials who oversaw the program, Norman appeared to be making remarkable progress in overcoming the psychological disorders that had driven him to become the Green Goblin, demonstrating the kind of personal growth and moral development that the program was designed to encourage. But beneath the carefully constructed facade of rehabilitation and reform, Norman was actually using his time in the Thunderbolts to study the inner workings of government superhero oversight, to build relationships with key officials and politicians, and to demonstrate his capacity for leadership and strategic thinking in ways that would make him seem like a valuable asset rather than a dangerous liability. Every therapy session was an opportunity to perfect his performance of sanity and remorse. Every successful mission was proof of his potential value as a government operative. The psychological manipulation that Norman employed during this period was subtle and sophisticated, designed to convince his handlers that his transformation was genuine, while also positioning himself for advancement within the government hierarchy. He understood that the key to long-term success was patience and gradual progression rather than dramatic gestures or obvious power grabs that might alert his supervisors to his true intentions. The relationships that Norman built with other members of the Thunderbolts served multiple purposes in his overall strategy, providing him with both genuine allies who believed in his rehabilitation and unwitting pawns who could be manipulated into supporting his agenda without fully understanding what they were helping to accomplish. His ability to inspire loyalty and trust among individuals who should have been most suspicious of his motives demonstrated the sophistication of his psychological manipulation and his understanding of human nature. The gradual expansion of Norman's authority and responsibilities within the Thunderbolts program was presented as a natural recognition of his leadership abilities and administrative competence, but it was actually the result of careful planning and strategic positioning that made his advancement seem inevitable and appropriate. Each new responsibility was accepted with apparent reluctance and genuine concern for the welfare of his teammates, creating the impression of a man who was being forced by circumstances to accept burdens he would prefer to avoid. The secret invasion event that would ultimately catapult Norman to national prominence was a crisis of unprecedented scope and complexity, as shape-shifting Skrull infiltrators revealed that they had been replacing key figures throughout Earth's superhero and political communities for years. The revelation that trusted heroes and officials might actually be alien imposters created an atmosphere of paranoia and mistrust that threatened to paralyze the very institutions that were supposed to protect humanity from such threats. Norman's response to the Skrull invasion was calculated to maximize both his immediate effectiveness and his long-term political benefit, demonstrating the same strategic thinking that had made him such a formidable criminal, while channeling it toward goals that appeared to serve the public interest. His analysis of Skrull tactics and weaknesses was genuinely insightful and valuable, providing military and intelligence officials with information that proved crucial in developing effective countermeasures. But perhaps more importantly, from Norman's perspective, his performance during the crisis demonstrated his capacity for decisive leadership under extreme pressure and his willingness to make difficult decisions that other officials were too paralyzed by uncertainty to attempt. His apparent transformation from criminal to hero was so dramatic and convincing that it overshadowed his previous activities and made him seem like exactly the kind of strong, practical leader that the country needed in such dangerous times. The moment that definitively established Norman as a national hero came during his dramatic confrontation with the Skrull Queen, when his apparently selfless actions saved countless lives and helped bring the invasion to an end. The televised images of Norman Osborn standing over the defeated alien leader became iconic symbols of human resilience and heroic determination, creating a public image that would be almost impossible for his critics to challenge or undermine. The psychological impact of seeing a former supervillain emerge as humanity's savior was profound and lasting, creating a narrative of redemption and second chances that resonated with public audiences who were eager to believe in the possibility of genuine transformation and moral growth. Norman's apparent journey from darkness to light became a symbol of hope and renewal that transcended his individual circumstances to represent broader themes of forgiveness and social rehabilitation. The appointment of Norman Osborn as director of the newly formed intelligence agency that would replace SHIELD was presented as a logical recognition of his proven competence and heroic service. But it also represented the culmination of a long-term strategy that had been years in the making. The position gave him access to classified information, control over significant resources, and the authority to direct superhero activities on a national scale. The transformation of SHIELD into the new organization that Norman would control was more than just a bureaucratic reorganization. It represented a fundamental shift in how the government approached superhero oversight and national security. Under Norman's leadership, the new agency would be more militaristic, more willing to use extreme methods, and more focused on results rather than adherence to traditional moral and legal constraints. The Iron Patriot armor that Norman created for himself was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation and symbolic communication, combining the technological sophistication of Tony Stark's Iron Man designs with the patriotic imagery and colors that would make him seem like the ultimate embodiment of American heroism. The armor was not just a tool for combat, but a statement about Norman's transformation and his commitment to protecting the country that had given him a second chance. The visual design of the Iron Patriot was carefully calculated to evoke positive associations with both technological innovation and traditional patriotic values, creating an image that would appeal to citizens who were looking for strong leadership in uncertain times. The red, white, and blue color scheme was not subtle, but it was effective in communicating Norman's apparent dedication to American ideals and his willingness to put the country's interests above his own personal concerns. The formation of the Dark Avengers represented the logical extension of Norman's approach to heroism, assembling a team of individuals who were willing to use more extreme methods than traditional heroes, while still operating under official government sanction. The team members were chosen not just for their combat capabilities, but for their willingness to follow orders and their lack of moral constraints that might interfere with mission effectiveness. The psychological profiles of the Dark Avengers members revealed individuals who were attracted to the combination of official authority and moral flexibility that Norman's leadership offered, creating a team dynamic that was based on shared pragmatism rather than idealistic heroism. These were people who understood that sometimes good results required morally questionable methods, and who were comfortable operating in the grey areas between heroism and villainy. Norman's leadership of the Dark Avengers was characterized by the same strategic thinking and psychological manipulation that had defined his criminal career, but now these skills were being employed in service of goals that were at least superficially aligned with legitimate government interests. His ability to inspire loyalty and coordinate complex operations made the team more effective than many traditional hero groups, even as their methods became increasingly controversial. The public relations campaign that accompanied the Dark Avengers' activities was sophisticated and comprehensive, designed to present their actions in the most favorable possible light, while minimizing attention to their more questionable methods. Norman understood that controlling the narrative was just as important as achieving operational success, and he invested significant resources in managing public perception and media coverage. The psychological impact of having a former supervillain in charge of national superhero policy was complex and multifaceted, creating both enthusiasm among citizens who appreciated his apparent effectiveness and concern among those who remembered his criminal past. Norman's ability to maintain public support despite growing evidence of his authoritarian tendencies demonstrated the power of fear and uncertainty to override moral concerns and democratic principles. The expansion of Norman's authority beyond superhero oversight to encompass broader aspects of national security represented a gradual accumulation of power that was justified by a series of genuine crises and legitimate threats. Each expansion was presented as a temporary measure necessitated by extraordinary circumstances, but collectively they created a concentration of authority that fundamentally altered the balance of power within the government. The psychological mechanisms that allowed Norman to maintain his facade of reformed heroism while gradually implementing increasingly authoritarian policies were based on his understanding of how people rationalize uncomfortable truths and avoid confronting evidence that contradicts their preferred beliefs. Citizens who wanted to believe in his transformation were willing to overlook or excuse actions that might have been unacceptable from someone with a less heroic public image. The corruption of legitimate government institutions under Norman's leadership was subtle and systematic, involving the gradual replacement of personnel who might question his methods with individuals who were more willing to prioritize results over procedures. This process was accomplished through standard administrative mechanisms that made it difficult to challenge without seeming to oppose necessary reforms and improvements. The siege of Asgard that would ultimately bring about Norman's downfall was both the logical culmination of his authoritarian tendencies and the inevitable result of his fundamental inability to distinguish between legitimate authority and personal power. His decision to launch an unprovoked attack on the realm of the Norse gods represented a catastrophic failure of judgment that revealed the extent to which power had corrupted his decision-making processes. The psychological factors that drove Norman to authorize the assault on Asgard were complex and multifaceted, involving his megalomaniacal need to prove his superiority, his paranoid fear of potential threats to his authority, and his fundamental inability to accept limits on his power and influence. The attack was not strategically necessary or politically advantageous, but it satisfied his emotional need to demonstrate dominance over beings that he perceived as potential rivals. The military and political consequences of the Asgard invasion were immediate and devastating, as the unprovoked aggression against peaceful entities exposed the true nature of Norman's regime and provided his critics with undeniable evidence of his unfitness for leadership. The heroic resistance mounted by traditional heroes who had been marginalized during his rise to power demonstrated the continuing appeal of genuine heroism over authoritarian efficiency. The collapse of Norman's political coalition was swift and comprehensive, as former allies distanced themselves from his increasingly extreme actions and sought to minimize their own complicity in his regime. The psychological dynamics of this abandonment reflected the same opportunistic calculations that had enabled his rise to power, as individuals who had benefited from his leadership suddenly discovered moral objections to methods they had previously endorsed. The ultimate defeat of Norman's forces during the siege of Asgard was both a military victory for traditional heroism and a psychological vindication of the principles that he had spent years undermining and corrupting. The sight of genuine heroes working together to oppose tyranny and protect the innocent provided a powerful contrast to the authoritarian efficiency that Norman had offered as an alternative to democratic idealism. The aftermath of Norman's fall from power was characterized by a complex process of reconstruction and accountability that raised fundamental questions about how democratic societies should respond to the appeal of authoritarian leadership during times of crisis. The recognition that Norman's rise had been enabled by legitimate fears and genuine failures in traditional institutions made it impossible to simply dismiss his regime as an aberration or historical accident. The psychological impact of Norman's dark reign on the Marvel Universe was profound and lasting, demonstrating how quickly democratic institutions could be corrupted and how easily public opinion could be manipulated by individuals who understood the relationship between fear and political authority. The experience served as a cautionary tale about the fragility of democratic values and the constant vigilance required to protect them from those who would exploit crisis for personal gain. As Norman's vision of a perfectly ordered world under his benevolent dictatorship crumbled around him, the true cost of his experiment in authoritarian heroism became clear, revealing the fundamental incompatibility between genuine heroism and the concentration of power in the hands of any single individual, no matter how competent or well-intentioned they might appear to be. The return of Norman Osborn to his Green Goblin identity in the modern era represents both a familiar homecoming and a dramatic evolution of one of comics' most enduring villains, as decades of accumulated experience, psychological damage, and technological advancement combined to create a version of the character that was simultaneously recognizable and utterly transformed. The Norman who emerged from the wreckage of his political ambitions was no longer the relatively straightforward megalomaniac of earlier eras, but a complex figure whose understanding of power, manipulation, and human nature had been refined through years of operating at the highest levels of government and society. The psychological impact of Norman's fall from legitimate authority back into criminal obscurity was profound and lasting, creating a form of existential crisis that went beyond simple disappointment or frustration to encompass fundamental questions about identity, purpose, and the nature of success itself. For years, Norman had operated under the assumption that his criminal activities were merely stepping stones toward greater, legitimate power, ways of demonstrating his superiority and competence that would eventually be recognized and rewarded by society at large. The collapse of his political career and the revelation of his authoritarian tendencies had shattered this comfortable self-deception, forcing him to confront the reality that his vision of benevolent dictatorship was neither benevolent nor particularly competent. The cognitive dissonance between his self-image as a visionary leader and the public perception of him as a dangerous megalomaniac created psychological tensions that manifested themselves in increasingly erratic and destructive behavior. The decision to return to the Green Goblin identity was not made impulsively or in a moment of desperate rage, but evolved gradually as Norman processed the implications of his political defeat and began to understand that legitimate power would never be available to him again. The Goblin persona offered him both a familiar framework for expressing his frustrated ambitions and a way of rejecting the societal constraints that had ultimately proven stronger than his will to power. But the Green Goblin who emerged from this psychological transformation was fundamentally different from previous incarnations, informed by years of experience operating within legitimate power structures and enhanced by a sophisticated understanding of media manipulation, political psychology, and organizational dynamics. This was not the relatively crude criminal mastermind of earlier eras, but a figure who understood how to leverage modern technology, social media, and global communications to achieve goals that went far beyond simple robbery or revenge. The technological resources available to Norman in the modern era were vastly superior to anything he had possessed during his earlier criminal career, reflecting both advances in general scientific knowledge and his own accumulated wealth and industrial connections. The modern Goblin glider incorporated stealth technology, advanced targeting systems, and defensive capabilities that made it more like a military aircraft than a simple flying platform, while his weapons and equipment reflected cutting-edge developments in materials, science, and energy projection. The pumpkin bombs and other Halloween-themed weapons that had always been Norman's trademark were updated with modern, explosive compounds and sophisticated delivery systems that made them far more deadly and precise than their earlier counterparts. But beyond their increased lethality, these weapons also incorporated psychological warfare elements designed to maximize their impact on both immediate targets and broader public consciousness. The costume and visual presentation of the modern Green Goblin reflected Norman's understanding of contemporary media and his appreciation for the importance of brand recognition in an increasingly crowded field of costumed criminals and heroes. The classic design elements were retained and enhanced rather than replaced, creating a look that was both nostalgic and threatening, familiar yet updated for contemporary sensibilities. The psychological profile that emerged from Norman's modern criminal activities revealed a mind that had been both enriched and corrupted by his experiences with legitimate authority, creating a villain who was more sophisticated in his methods, but also more fundamentally damaged in his understanding of human relationships and social responsibility. His time in government had taught him valuable lessons about manipulation and control, but it had also reinforced his megalomaniacal tendencies and his contempt for democratic processes and individual rights. The criminal organizations that Norman built during this period reflected his enhanced understanding of modern business practices and organizational psychology, creating networks that were more resilient and effective than traditional criminal enterprises, while also being more difficult for law enforcement agencies to infiltrate or disrupt. These organizations operated according to legitimate business principles while pursuing fundamentally illegitimate goals, creating a hybrid form of criminality that was uniquely suited to contemporary conditions. The recruitment and management of subordinates during this period demonstrated Norman's sophisticated understanding of human motivation and his ability to inspire loyalty among individuals who should have known better than to trust him. His approach to leadership combined genuine competence and strategic vision with carefully calibrated applications of fear and reward, creating organizational cultures that were simultaneously productive and deeply dysfunctional. The Red Goblin persona that Norman adopted during his bonding with the Carnage symbiote represented perhaps the most dangerous and psychologically disturbing phase of his modern criminal career, combining his enhanced intelligence and strategic capabilities with the raw, destructive power and moral flexibility of the symbiote organism. This fusion created a being that was more than the sum of its parts, possessing capabilities that exceeded either component while amplifying the worst characteristics of both. The psychological dynamics of the symbiotic relationship were complex and mutually reinforcing, as the symbiote's hunger for violence and chaos complemented Norman's need for dominance and control, while his strategic intelligence provided the symbiote with more sophisticated outlets for its destructive impulses. The resulting partnership was more effective than either entity could have been alone, but it was also more unstable and ultimately self-destructive. The visual design of the Red Goblin combined the classic Goblin aesthetic with the organic horror of symbiote biology, creating an appearance that was both familiar and utterly alien. The red and black color scheme suggested both blood and darkness, while the flowing organic lines of the symbiote contrasted dramatically with the mechanical precision of traditional Goblin equipment and costumes. The absolute carnage event that brought Norman into conflict with other symbiote hosts demonstrated his ability to operate on a global scale while pursuing goals that transcended simple personal revenge or criminal profit. His role in hunting down and eliminating individuals who had previously bonded with symbiote organisms revealed a strategic vision that encompassed long-term threats and opportunities, rather than just immediate tactical advantages. The symbiote hunting campaign was both personally motivated by Norman's desire to eliminate potential rivals and strategically logical as a way of consolidating symbiote-based power under his control. His understanding of symbiote biology and psychology allowed him to predict and counter the actions of other hosts, while also developing weapons and techniques that were specifically designed to exploit symbiote vulnerabilities. The psychological impact of the symbiote bond on Norman's already damaged psyche was profound and lasting, amplifying his existing mental health issues, while also introducing new forms of instability and unpredictability. The constant presence of the symbiote's alien consciousness created a form of psychological pressure that even Norman's enhanced intellect struggled to manage effectively. The eventual separation from the Carnage symbiote was both a relief and a profound loss for Norman, as he found himself missing the enhanced capabilities and emotional intensity that the bond had provided, while also recognizing the self-destructive trajectory that it had imposed on his activities. The experience left him more isolated and psychologically damaged than ever before, but also more aware of his own limitations and vulnerabilities. The Sins Past storyline controversy that emerged during this period represented one of the most contentious and emotionally charged developments in Spider-Man's publishing history, as writers attempted to retroactively alter fundamental aspects of Peter Parker's relationship with Gwen Stacy in ways that many fans found offensive and unnecessary. Norman's alleged involvement with Gwen before her death was presented as evidence of his capacity for personal violation that went beyond his criminal activities. The retconning of classic storylines and relationships during this period reflected broader trends in comic book publishing toward revisionism and psychological complexity, but it also demonstrated the dangers of altering established continuity in ways that undermined the emotional foundations of beloved stories. The attempts to make Norman's evil more personal and intimate often had the unintended effect of diminishing the impact of his more straightforward criminal activities. The Goblin Nation storyline that emerged from Norman's efforts to build a criminal empire based on the Goblin identity represented both the culmination of his organizational ambitions and a reflection of his understanding of contemporary criminal networks and international terrorism. The Nation was not just a criminal organization, but an ideological movement based on Norman's vision of social hierarchy and technological supremacy. The recruitment and indoctrination processes used to build Goblin Nation reflected Norman's understanding of cult psychology and religious extremism, creating an organization that inspired genuine devotion among its members while also maintaining strict hierarchical control. The Goblin identity became not just a criminal persona, but a philosophical framework that provided meaning and purpose to individuals who felt alienated from mainstream society. The global reach of Goblin Nation and its activities demonstrated Norman's evolution from local criminal to international terrorist, as his operations expanded to encompass multiple countries and continents while pursuing goals that transcended simple profit or revenge. His understanding of globalization and international communications allowed him to coordinate activities across vast distances while maintaining operational security. The modern iterations of classic Green Goblin concepts and equipment reflected both technological advancement and Norman's accumulated understanding of what had worked and what had failed in his previous criminal career. Every weapon, vehicle, and tactical approach was refined and improved based on decades of experience and continuous innovation. The psychological evolution of Norman's character during the modern era was marked by increasing sophistication in his understanding of human nature and social dynamics, but also by growing isolation from genuine human connection and emotional authenticity. His enhanced capabilities came at the cost of his remaining humanity, creating a figure who was more effective as a villain but less relatable as a character. The enduring nature of the Spider-Man and Green Goblin dynamic in the modern era reflected both the fundamental compatibility of their respective archetypes and the continued relevance of their core conflicts to contemporary audiences. The themes of responsibility versus power, scientific progress versus human values, and personal relationships versus public obligations remained as compelling in the modern era as they had been during the character's original creation. The updating of classic elements for modern sensibilities involved careful balance between nostalgia and innovation, maintaining the essential characteristics that made the characters recognizable while adapting their presentations and motivations to reflect contemporary concerns and storytelling techniques. The challenge was to make decades-old concepts feel fresh and relevant without losing the qualities that had made them enduring and beloved. As Norman's modern criminal career continued to evolve and develop, the fundamental questions about identity, responsibility, and the nature of heroism and villainy remained as central to his character as they had ever been, ensuring that the Green Goblin would continue to serve as both an entertaining antagonist and a meaningful exploration of the darker aspects of human ambition and scientific progress. The Goblin's cackle still echoed through the canyons of New York City, carrying with it the accumulated weight of decades of tragedy, triumph, and the endless cycle of conflict between order and chaos, responsibility and power, humanity, and the monsters we create when we reach too far beyond our moral and emotional limitations. The physiological and psychological effects of the Goblin formula on Norman Osborn's body and mind represent one of the most comprehensive human enhancement programs ever documented in the Marvel Universe, a biochemical transformation that fundamentally altered not just his physical capabilities, but the very structure of his personality and moral reasoning. The formula that emerged from Mendelstrom's research was never intended to create a supervillain, but rather to push the boundaries of human potential in ways that could benefit all of humanity, making the tragic corruption of its effects all the more poignant and scientifically significant. The enhancement of Norman's physical strength to superhuman levels was achieved through a complex restructuring of his muscular and skeletal systems that increased both the density of his muscle fibers and the efficiency of his body's energy production and utilization mechanisms. The resulting strength enhancement allowed him to lift approximately 9 tons under optimal conditions, placing him in a category of physical capability that was comparable to Spider-Man himself, while also providing the foundation for his ability to withstand the physical stresses of aerial combat and extended periods of superhero-level activity. But the strength enhancement was accompanied by corresponding improvements to his cardiovascular system, nervous system, and metabolic processes that created a comprehensive upgrade to his entire physical infrastructure. His heart became more efficient at pumping blood. His lungs became more effective at processing oxygen, and his digestive system became more capable of extracting nutrients from food, creating a biological machine that was optimized for peak performance under extreme conditions. The enhancement of Norman's reflexes and reaction time was perhaps even more significant than his strength increase, as it allowed him to operate the sophisticated flying vehicles and complex weapons systems that became his trademark, while also enabling him to engage in hand-to-hand combat with opponents who possessed similar or superior physical capabilities. The improved neural processing speed meant that he could perceive and respond to threats with superhuman efficiency, making him a formidable opponent even for heroes with enhanced senses and combat training. The durability enhancements provided by the formula were designed to protect Norman's enhanced body from the increased stresses that his improved capabilities would create, reinforcing his bones, strengthening his connective tissues, and improving his body's ability to recover from injuries that would be debilitating or fatal to normal humans. This durability was demonstrated repeatedly throughout his career as he survived explosions, crashes, and physical assaults that should have killed him multiple times over. The accelerated healing factor that the formula provided was not as dramatic as those possessed by characters like Wolverine or Deadpool, but it was sufficient to allow Norman to recover from serious injuries in days or weeks rather than months or years. This capability was crucial to his survival during his apparent death and subsequent resurrection, as his enhanced physiology was able to repair damage that would have been permanently fatal to an unenhanced individual. Perhaps most significantly, the Goblin formula enhanced Norman's already formidable intelligence to levels that bordered on genius, expanding his capacity for strategic thinking, pattern recognition, and complex problem solving, while also accelerating his ability to process and retain new information. This intellectual enhancement was what enabled him to design and build the sophisticated weapons and equipment that made him such a dangerous opponent, while also allowing him to develop the elaborate long-term schemes that characterized his most successful villainous campaigns. But the cognitive enhancements came with psychological costs that were not immediately apparent and may not have been fully anticipated by the formula's original designers. The increased intelligence was accompanied by corresponding changes to Norman's personality structure that amplified his existing narcissistic tendencies while diminishing his capacity for empathy and emotional connection with other human beings. The psychological profile that emerged from Norman's transformation revealed a mind that was simultaneously more capable and more damaged than it had been before the enhancement, as the formula appeared to have strengthened his intellectual and strategic capabilities while weakening the emotional and moral constraints that had previously limited his willingness to harm others in pursuit of his goals. This combination of enhanced capability with reduced moral restraint created the perfect conditions for the emergence of a criminal mastermind of unprecedented sophistication and danger. The arsenal of weapons and equipment that Norman developed for his Green Goblin persona represented a perfect fusion of advanced scientific knowledge with psychological warfare principles, creating tools that were designed not just to cause physical harm, but to terrorize and demoralize his opponents, while also serving his theatrical sensibilities and need for dramatic self-expression. Each piece of equipment was carefully designed to serve multiple functions, while also reinforcing the Goblin mythology that he had constructed around his criminal identity. The Goblin glider that became his signature vehicle was far more than a simple means of transportation, representing one of the most sophisticated pieces of personal aviation technology ever created outside of military or government programs. The original flying broomstick was quickly replaced by increasingly advanced designs that incorporated stealth capabilities, advanced targeting systems, defensive countermeasures, and offensive weapons platforms that made the glider a formidable combat vehicle in its own right. The engineering principles behind the glider's design reflected Norman's understanding of both aerodynamics and psychological impact, creating a vehicle that was not only highly functional, but also visually striking and intimidating to observers on the ground. The bat-like wing configuration was chosen not just for its aerodynamic efficiency, but for its ability to create a menacing silhouette that would inspire fear and uncertainty among potential opponents and innocent bystanders alike. The pumpkin bombs that became Norman's most recognizable weapons were masterpieces of miniaturized explosive technology that combined maximum destructive potential with minimum weight and size constraints. The Halloween-themed design was not merely decorative but served important psychological functions, creating weapons that were simultaneously playful and terrifying, familiar and threatening, amusing and deadly. The variety of different pumpkin bomb configurations that Norman developed over the years demonstrated both his technical expertise and his understanding of tactical flexibility, with specialized versions designed for specific purposes, including standard explosives, incendiary devices, gas dispensers, flashbang disorientation weapons, and electronic warfare tools. This variety allowed him to adapt his tactics to different situations while maintaining the consistent visual and thematic elements that reinforced his Goblin identity. The razor bats and other projectile weapons that Norman employed were designed according to similar principles, combining practical functionality with psychological impact, while also serving the theatrical requirements of his chosen persona. These weapons were engineered to be both visually distinctive and mechanically superior to conventional alternatives, giving him tactical advantages while also reinforcing his reputation for innovation and unpredictability. The electrical systems integrated into Norman's costume and equipment allowed him to generate and project electrical discharges that could be used for both offensive and defensive purposes, creating another layer of capability that enhanced his combat effectiveness, while also providing him with non-lethal options when the situation required restraint or precision, rather than maximum destruction. The psychological analysis of Norman's criminal behavior reveals a complex individual whose motivations and decision-making processes were influenced by a combination of enhanced intellectual capabilities, chemically altered personality structures, and deeply rooted psychological trauma dating back to his childhood experiences with his abusive father. Understanding Norman requires recognizing that he was simultaneously a victim of circumstances beyond his control and a perpetrator of terrible crimes that caused immeasurable suffering to innocent people. The genius-level intellect that Norman possessed even before his chemical enhancement was amplified by the Goblin formula into something that approached superintelligence in certain areas, particularly those related to strategic planning, technological development, and psychological manipulation. This enhanced intelligence allowed him to see patterns and possibilities that escaped normal human perception, but it also contributed to his growing sense of superiority and his decreasing ability to relate to people of normal intellectual capacity. The madness that characterized Norman's behavior was not random or chaotic, but followed its own internal logic that was based on premises and assumptions that were fundamentally different from those that guided normal human behavior. His actions often seemed irrational to outside observers, but they made perfect sense within the framework of his altered worldview and enhanced cognitive processes. The obsession with Spider-Man that drove so much of Norman's criminal career was rooted in a complex mixture of professional rivalry, personal hatred, and psychological projection that made their conflict far more than a simple case of hero versus villain. Norman saw in Spider-Man both a worthy opponent who could challenge his enhanced capabilities and a symbol of everything that he had been unable to achieve through legitimate means. The father figure dynamic that characterized Norman's relationship with Peter Parker added layers of psychological complexity that went far beyond their superhero conflict, as Norman's interactions with his son's best friend reflected both his desire to be a good father and his fundamental inability to form healthy emotional relationships with anyone, including his own family members. This tension between his paternal impulses and his criminal activities created internal conflicts that manifested themselves in increasingly erratic and self-destructive behavior. The parallels between Norman Osborn and Peter Parker were numerous and significant, reflecting the way that similar circumstances and capabilities could lead to vastly different moral choices and life outcomes. Both men were brilliant scientists who had gained enhanced abilities through accidental exposure to experimental substances. Both had experienced profound losses that shaped their worldviews, and both possessed the intelligence and resources to make significant impacts on the world around them. But where Peter had chosen to use his abilities in service of others and had allowed his moral principles to guide his actions, even when doing so required personal sacrifice, Norman had chosen to pursue his own interests and ambitions, without regard for the harm that his choices might cause to innocent people. This fundamental difference in moral orientation was what separated the hero from the villain, despite their many surface similarities and shared experiences. The enduring nature of the Green Goblin, as Spider-Man's greatest foe, was based not just on the personal stakes involved in their conflict, but on the way that Norman represented everything that Peter could become if he ever abandoned his moral principles and allowed his enhanced abilities to corrupt his judgment and values. Norman was Peter's shadow self, the dark reflection of what scientific genius and superhuman capability could become when divorced from ethical constraints and human compassion. The personal nature of their conflict distinguished it from Spider-Man's battles with other villains who might be more powerful or more dangerous, but who lacked the intimate knowledge of Peter's civilian life and personal relationships that made Norman such a unique threat. Other enemies might endanger Spider-Man's life or challenge his abilities, but only Norman could threaten his identity, his family, and his fundamental sense of who he was as a person. The tragic dimension of Norman's character lay in the glimpses of potential goodness and genuine human feeling that occasionally emerged during his periods of amnesia or moments of clarity, suggesting that somewhere beneath the layers of chemical enhancement and psychological damage, there remained traces of the man he might have been under different circumstances. These moments made his evil more poignant, because they revealed that his transformation into a monster was not inevitable, but was the result of choices and circumstances that might have been different. The cyclical nature of Norman's psychological problems, with periods of apparent recovery followed by returns to his Green Goblin identity, reflected the complex interaction between his chemical enhancements, his underlying personality disorders, and the external stresses that triggered his relapses into criminality. This pattern made him both more sympathetic as a character struggling with mental illness and more dangerous as an opponent whose behavior was unpredictable and potentially explosive. The impact of Norman's activities on his family relationships, particularly his destructive influence on his son Harry, demonstrated how the consequences of his choices extended far beyond his immediate victims to encompass multiple generations and innocent individuals who had no direct involvement in his conflicts with Spider-Man. This generational damage was perhaps the most tragic aspect of his legacy, as it showed how evil could perpetuate itself through modeling and psychological inheritance. The broader implications of Norman's character for understanding the nature of heroism and villainy were significant and lasting, as his story demonstrated that intelligence, capability, and even good intentions were not sufficient to guarantee positive outcomes without the moral framework and emotional health necessary to guide their application. His example served as a cautionary tale about the importance of character and values in determining how power and ability would be used. As the complete analysis of Norman Osborn's powers, psychology, and significance draws to a close, the picture that emerges is of a character whose complexity and depth have made him one of the most compelling and enduring figures in superhero fiction. Someone whose story encompasses themes of genius and madness, power and responsibility, love and hatred, redemption and damnation that continue to resonate with audiences decades after his first appearance. The Green Goblin endures not just because he is a formidable opponent for Spider-Man, but because he represents fundamental questions about human nature and the choices that define us all. As our journey through the twisted corridors of Norman Osborn's mind comes to an end, we're left with the understanding that the Green Goblin represents more than just another costumed villain. He is the shadow that follows every hero, the price of great power, the reminder that genius without wisdom leads to destruction. In Norman's cackle, we hear the echo of every choice that led him down the path to madness. Every moment where he chose power over love, control over compassion. The Green Goblin endures because he represents the darkness that exists within brilliance, the monster that can emerge when ego and intellect are divorced from humanity. So as you drift into peaceful sleep, remember that even in our dreams, we must choose between the light of responsibility and the seductive shadows of power. Sleep well, knowing that heroes like Spider-Man stand watch against the goblins of our world, and that even the darkest villains began as someone's child, someone's hope, before they chose to become something else entirely.